Christmas, Love and Mr. Darcy. Written by P.O. Dixon, narrated by Andy Robert. Chapter 1. London, England, December 1811. What has become of the truth universally acknowledged that the holiday season is a special time of year generally spent with one's family? You and I always spend Christmas together. Fitzwilliam Darcy hardly knew how to look or how to feel while listening to his sister's plans for the Christmas season. He could not help being dismayed. I've already made arrangements for us to travel to Matlock. A serious young man of 27, he shouldered a weighty burden, being the master of a grand estate, responsible for hundreds of livelihoods, and the co-guardian of his young sister, owing to their parents' deaths. There they sat having breakfast at the large mahogany dining-room table, heavily laden with fresh fruit, various meats, and other delectable dishes which belied its setting for two. Miss Georgiana Darcy, unable to support the idea of grieving a brother whom she almost looked up to as a father, shifted in her chair and put on a strong face. Now that she was growing older, she no doubt looked forward to the prospect of spending time with others who were closer to her in age. At that moment, she caused him a great deal of consternation. Darcy was not used to having his wishes subjugated by others. "Does your desire to be apart from me have anything to do with what happened last summer?" he asked, tempering his tone to mask his disappointed hopes. He was referring to his sister's near brush with scandal, in which a former family acquaintance, a Mr. George Wickham, had followed her to Ramsgate and preyed upon her innocence. Just thinking of that vile man's intentions toward Georgiana turned Darcy's stomach. He loathed the man, even though he and Wickham once lived together at Pemberley, Darcy's estate in Derbyshire. Darcy's late father had made Wickham his godson, for heaven's sake. What a harrowing turn of events. Georgiana was a gentleman's daughter, and the granddaughter of an earl. Wickham was the son of her late father's former steward. She was but 15. Wickham was almost twice her age. Georgiana stood to assume her place among society's elites when she came of age. Her future was bright. Heaven only knew what was to become of Wickham, but considering the path he had chosen, his prospects were dim. A gamester, a scoundrel, and a deadbeat. Such an alliance bordered on lunacy. Still, the childhood fondness that she had cherished toward the would-be suitor was enough for her to accept his professions of love and his proposal of marriage. Georgiana confided the entire elopement scheme to Darcy upon his unexpected yet timely arrival in Ramsgate. Perhaps her confession was a testament to her love for her older brother, whose opinion meant everything to her, or her enthusiasm over marrying a gentleman whom she adored, or some naive combination of the two that persuaded her to confide in him. Whatever was the reason, it mattered not. Darcy was livid. A single encounter between him and Wickham, in which Darcy declared his former friend turned nemesis would never receive a penny of Georgiana's fortune, was all that it took to send the latter scurrying on his way empty-handed. He had yet to explain to her the actual reason he had sent Wickham away. He believed it would be one of the most challenging conversations he could have with his young sister. She had suffered enough shame over what she had almost done. Besides, as an older brother, Darcy meant to protect his sister, not subject her to further anguish. Despite Georgiana's ensuing heartbreak, Darcy had not taught himself to regret his actions. He would not hesitate to do it again. He told his sister as much. Concluding his assertion, he said, "I dare not apologize for doing what was right in separating the two of you." "Brother, I do not expect you to apologize. However, the fact remains that I was close to getting married, which means I am no longer a child." "You are only 16. "Old enough to get married? With consent, of course. Why, some of my friends are planning their coming-out balls and presentation at court already." "Is that something you're hoping for as well?" "I know you believe I ought to wait, and I have no objections. I only mentioned it hoping you will quit thinking of me as a child and start regarding me as the young woman I'm becoming, one with thoughts and desires of my own," Georgiana said. "None of that detracts from the fact that I esteem you as an older brother." She gave Darcy a sidelong glance. Your friend Lord Milton has given his consent for Lady Susanne to join the party, if that makes any difference to you. I know how much you respect him." "Very well," Darcy half conceded. "So long as there is nothing more to your spending Christmas in Somersetshire, I can have no objections." Georgiana drew a quick breath. "So are you saying that you do not believe my intentions are good? Do you think I've learnt nothing from my experience last summer?" With a petulant air, she plucked up her linen napkin and brushed it against her lips. "Fine," Georgiana said before Darcy could respond. "If the two of us spending Christmas together means so much to you that you'd question my sincerity, I will not go. I shall linger by your side each and every minute of each and every day. Will that make you happy?" "No," said Darcy, shaking his head. "What I meant to say is yes, it would delight me to spend time with you. But I do not mean to force you into doing so. Your happiness is my primary concern. It always has been and always will be." He hoped this response served its intended purpose of supporting her wishes, even if it meant discouraging his own. "Pray, travel to Somersetshire with your friends. Do so with my blessings and my most heartfelt wish for your enjoyment." His concession brought a smile to Georgiana's face. "I'm certain you shall enjoy the season as well. With so many acquaintances in town at this time of year, I'm sure you will not want for diversions." "No doubt," Darcy responded, picking up the daily paper he had set aside upon Georgiana's joining him for breakfast. "By the by, I wonder what Miss Elizabeth Bennet's plans are for this season." Darcy's heart banged against his chest at the mention of her name. He peered up from his paper. He could not deny he, too, often thought of Elizabeth and what she was doing. With whom did she spend her time? Would he ever see her again? His sister, however, could not possibly know his innermost thoughts. "Of all people, why would you ask about Miss Elizabeth?" "Oh," Georgiana said, bringing her porcelain cup to her lips. "I recall you frequently mentioning her in your letters from Hertfordshire." She took a sip. "I suppose I'm a little curious about how she is spending Christmas." Chapter 2. 2 weeks later. Despite his wife's penchant for early rising, Darcy knew being aroused at 3 in the morning was not Elizabeth's idea of how to start the day. "You must join me," he murmured to a slightly annoyed young mistress, as he aided her in donning a long, lush, velvety robe. Taking her by the hand, Darcy led her from the bedroom, through the French doors onto the balcony. Although there were several purposely arranged seats from which to choose, Darcy took one nearest the door and pulled his wife into his lap. Now fully awakened by the frosty air and having darted her eyes from one seat to another, Elizabeth opened her mouth to question his purposes. Her protest silenced by a sweep of his lips against her cheek, Elizabeth nestled in Darcy's arms. "How else does a man violently in love with his wife admire the stars?" he whispered in her ear, his warm breath caressing her skin. He wrapped the extra thick blanket that he brought along for good measure around both of them. Darcy never grew tired of such ardent displays of affection toward Elizabeth. He had promised her that awakening her at such an unseemly hour would be well worth the effort. He was right. High above in the dark, tranquil sky, a blanket of stars sparkled like diamonds. A lone star shone brighter than all the rest. Placing his hand underneath her chin, he coaxed her to look at that star in particular. While Elizabeth peered up at the dazzling display, Darcy gazed at her. The celestial wonders he had admired for years paled compared to the sparkle in her alluring dark eyes. He had waited all his life to experience that moment with the woman he loved. He had dreamed of holding her in his arms and making love to her until the sun came up, especially during that special time of year. With his hands clasped lovingly about her waist, and his chin resting on her shoulder, Darcy whispered in Elizabeth's ear, "Merry Christmas, Mrs. Darcy." Tearing her eyes from the brilliant, picturesque sky high above, Elizabeth turned to face him. She peered into Darcy's eyes. Closing her own, she leaned in. What started as a gentle kiss upon his lips turned into something more. The heavy blanket was fulfilling its intended purpose. Soon enough, She was sitting astride her deeply enamoured husband. Soft moans pierced the silent night. Darcy's eyes flew open. "What is happening to me?" he wondered. He threaded his fingers through his dark curls before spreading his hand across his face. Ever since his sister had mentioned Miss Elizabeth Bennet's name, he had spent his nights dreaming of the bewitching young woman from Hertfordshire in one fashion or another. As his friend, as his lover, and, as just transpired, his wife. Just as he had done in his dream, he got out of bed and, donning a heavy robe, made his way out the double doors onto his terrace. Alone at Christmas. As he stared up at the distant bright star, the cold winter's air filled his lungs. Reflections on the holiday season filled the silent void. Darcy thought of Christmases in the past. He thought of the Christmas present. Most of all, he thought of what future Christmases might portend if circumstances in his life continued as they were currently unfolding. Being surrounded by one's loved ones was the very essence of the season, a feeling Darcy often dreamed of. Christmas in Derbyshire, be it at Matlock or Pemberley, snowflakes in the air, and family and friends everywhere. More often than not, snow-carpeted fields stretched as distant as the eyes could see, glistening underneath the moonlit skies at night, and blinding under the bright sun during the day. Darcy rested both hands on the cold stone balustrade. He never thought he would be apart from Georgiana, his closest living relation. He never considered she might choose to spend time with her new friends. That year of all years especially struck him hard. Not that he was completely alone. Darcy had other family members. He could spend time with his family if he chose. He might visit the Matlocks in Derbyshire as he had planned originally, or even his Aunt Lady Catherine de Bourgh and his cousin Anne de Bourgh in Kent. Darcy was honestly not of a mind to make either journey without his sister in tow. He scoffed a little at this notion. What was lineage and tradition to a 16-year-old girl whose acquaintances of her own age were continually increasing? Could he blame his sister, more than a decade his junior, for not wishing to spend the holiday with him? As it sometimes did from time to time, Darcy's heart ached over what he now considered his neglect towards her. He had been rather amiss toward his sister, especially during the last couple of years. For instance, when he took her from her home at Pemberley and put her up in her own establishment in London, entrusting her care to an unscrupulous woman who meant Georgiana no good. A woman who placed his sister in harm's way. True, he had shown up at Ramsgate in time to save her from what would have been the biggest mistake of her lifetime. Still, whether he and she agreed on his actions, Darcy could not always say. One day Georgiana really will be beyond my protection. She will get married, hopefully to a good man. She will have a family of her own. Is this to be my fate? A single man always on the outside looking in? Should I not be making plans for my own future happiness? Whenever Darcy felt that way, only one woman came to his mind. The one woman of his acquaintance who seemed wholly indifferent to him. Miss Elizabeth Bennet. Darcy scoffed. Wholly indifferent is putting it mildly. I strongly suspect she hates me. How could he fault the young lady for feeling the way she did? What had he done since first making her acquaintance in Hertfordshire all those months ago besides antagonize her? By the time he resolved to earn her good opinion, circumstances had conspired to make his attempts absurd. He recalled the night of the Netherfield ball in November. He had singled out Miss Elizabeth Bennet for a dance. The same night she had argued with him about George Wickham of all people. Also the same night her mother, her 3 younger sisters, and at one point even her father had rendered themselves utterly ridiculous and entirely unacceptable in his eyes. The mother especially disgusted him. What with a lengthy recitation of the would-be marriage between her eldest daughter and Darcy's friend Mr. Charles Bingley, the woman talked to her neighbour Lady Lucas freely, openly, and of nothing else but her expectation that her daughter would soon marry Mr. Bingley. It was an animating subject, and Mrs. Bennet seemed incapable of fatigue while enumerating the match's advantages. His being such a charming young man, and rich, and living only 3 miles from them, were the first self-gratulation points. Added to that, she was boasting of what a comfort it was to think how fond the 2 sisters were of her daughter, and the certainty that they must desire the connection as much as she did. The eager mamma had even boasted of the impending wedding being a good thing for her younger daughters, for the eldest's marrying so advantageously must throw them in the way of other rich men. The worst part was Mrs. Bennet had boasted openly about this absurdity sitting well within Darcy's hearing. She had even laughed at the notion that such speculations might offend him. Even if Darcy had successfully earned Miss Elizabeth Bennet's esteem, what would have been the point? It must materially lessen their chance of marrying men of any consideration in the world. Darcy had expressed those exact words when describing his earliest impression of the Bennet daughters, owing to their connections with tradesmen. Yet, only 4 to 5 weeks later, the eldest daughter was on the precipice of a hasty, poorly thought-out alliance. His budding feelings for the second eldest Bennet daughter aside, Darcy had no choice but to rescue his friend from a most disadvantageous alliance by getting him away from Hertfordshire as soon as humanly possible. There was only one problem with Darcy's magnanimous scheme. His own heart and mind were not in accordance. He never recognised that conundrum more than in those lonely moments in time spent with memories of Elizabeth Bennet as his only companions. Some might argue that being alone differed from being lonely. On that day, Darcy was both alone and lonely. It mattered not that the former was by choice. Truth be told, the latter also applied to him more than he might have wished over the years. Darcy had known loss. Each loss intensified the loneliness he felt during that time of year. Lord Richard Fitzwilliam and Lady Charlotte, his maternal grandparents, passed away when Darcy was little more than a toddler. He lost his paternal grandparents, Stephen and Lily and Andrews Darcy, by the age of 9. He had lost his beloved mother, Lady Anne Darcy, at the tender age of 11. The most painful loss of all was the loss that propelled him into adulthood, the loss of his excellent father, Mr. Gerald Darcy. The events surrounding his father's passing had moulded and defined him as the serious man that people knew and understood him to be. But he was not so severe as not to yearn for that special feeling, the joy that only the season could bring. Alone on Christmas Day in his London townhouse, Darcy's anguish was all but complete. "I'm on the heels of suffering one of the longest days of my life." He could have accepted the generosity of his friends and partaken in their family festivities. He chose not to. To find himself on the outside looking in did not satisfy his idea of pleasure. Indeed, it was worse than being alone. The possibility that such would be his fate the following Christmas, or even the Christmas after that, was unfathomable. Besides, Darcy had suffered more than his fair share of agony and discomfort already. Having remained in London, he accepted an invitation from Mr. Randall Hurst and his wife Louisa to dine with the 2 of them along with Bingley and Miss Caroline Bingley at their home on Christmas Eve. Miss Bingley's sycophancy towards him merely heightened the distress Darcy felt in seeing his friend Bingley's general malaise. Charles, who was always amiable and gregarious, now dwelled in misery of the acutest kind. Darcy himself had been the means of injuring his friend, and his reasons seemed paltry in hindsight. Twice that year he had intervened in the lives of those closest to him. What was there to show for it? True, Darcy had not taught himself to regret saving his sister. He was her legal guardian after all, her protector. He did what he had to do. But his friend was a full-grown man, entitled to make his own decisions and his own mistakes. This truth struck Darcy with a vengeance. How had it not occurred to him before? He tolerated no such interference in his own life. What a hypocrite I've proved myself to be. Darcy knew what he needed to do. I must tell my friend Bingley everything he needs to know. Chapter 3. Longbourn Village, Hertfordshire, England. Over a month had passed since the Netherfield party took their leave of Hertfordshire. Weeks since Elizabeth had refused the hand of her cousin Mr. William Collins in marriage. The first incident broke Elizabeth's older sister Jane's heart. The second broke her mother's heart. Both contributed to the general disturbance in the air at Longbourn. Mrs. Fanny Bennet, Longbourn's matriarch, who fancied herself nervous whenever she was discontented, constantly complained of being ill-used, having suffered the loss of 2 potential sons-in-law. Even the gaieties of the Christmas season could not pacify her wounds. Elizabeth was never designed for regret over what might have been, and especially not during such a special time of year. Christmas Day at Longbourn was always a cause for celebration. Elizabeth was determined that particular year would be no exception, even if the looks she read in her neighbours' faces after church services that morning still spoke of sorrow for Jane's misfortunes and astonishment over Elizabeth's. She had a plan, one that involved rallying her entire family to her cause. "Come, dearest Jane," Elizabeth said. "Let us not waste a single moment of this glorious day lamenting the loss of our mother's would-have-been sons-in-law. Let us go out among our neighbours and friends and show them that we Bennets will be neither pitied nor scorned." "Lizzie, what on earth has got into you?" "Why, the Christmas spirit," she exclaimed. "Do not pretend you were unaffected by the unspoken concern in everyone's eyes at church. I say we put an end to their silent complaints once and for all." "And how do you propose we do that?" "I say we go from house to house, spreading joy with our favourite songs of the season." "The 2 of us?" "No, all of us. Our sisters, Mary, Kitty and Lydia, our uncle and Aunt Gardiner and the children, even Mamma and Papa, and of course the 2 of us. I exclude no one. Now, come along at once, for I shall rely on you to help me persuade the others." "I'm uncertain if I ought to entertain such folly," said Jane. "Of course you should, as should all of us. What have we done to deny ourselves of the gaieties this season brings?" Another 10 minutes of cajoling proved sufficient to change Jane's mind. It was then time to rally the rest of the family to Elizabeth's joyous cause. As expected, rallying the 3rd eldest Bennet daughter, Mary, to their cause was the simple part, for she was always impatient for application, even if her skills were wanting. Persuading Kitty required little effort as well. Once they offered the hint of serenading the officers from the local militia to the younger sister Lydia. Despite being the elder of the 2, Kitty never failed to follow Lydia's lead. Seeing how important it was to Elizabeth that everyone take part in the festivity, Mrs. Madeline Gardiner, who was visiting from town, heartily agreed on behalf of her husband, Mr. Edward Gardiner, and all their children, to join the Bennets on the proposed outing. The only task that remained was getting Longbourn's patriarch and matriarch to go along with the scheme. Being that Elizabeth was not exactly her mother's favourite, Jane volunteered to recruit Mrs. Bennet. Being that Elizabeth was indeed her father's favourite, he had even sided with her against his wife when Elizabeth refused her cousin's hand in marriage, it made sense that she would approach Mr. Bennet. Elizabeth found him in his study, with his feet resting on the footrest by the fireplace. No doubt the fire's warmth and room's tranquillity had conspired to lure him into a midday slumber. She cleared her throat before approaching him. Jolted, he turned to face his daughter. "Lizzie, my dear," he said, "to what do I owe the pleasure of this visit?" "Well, Papa," she said, taking a seat on the now abandoned footrest, "I have a favour to ask of you. But before I do, I ask you to please keep an open mind." "You wound me, my dear. When have you ever known me to be closed-minded about anything? I'm as open-minded as one can be." Elizabeth knew her father very well. She might have argued his point and easily won, but that would have been entirely contrary to her purposes. Instead, she said, "In the spirit of the season, all our family has agreed to go carolling." "And what does that have to do with me?" "Why, you must join us, of course." Mr. Bennet half chuckled, half scoffed. "And why on earth would I do that? Besides, it is cold outside. I would much rather stay here by the warm fire. Now, run along, my dear, run along." "Papa, it is Christmas Day. It is not every day that such an opportunity presents itself. Who knows what next year or the year after that will bring? Surely an open-minded person such as you can appreciate the value of living without regrets. What if we should never have another chance to spend Christmas together as a family again?" The grey-haired gentleman reared his head. "Has Mr. Bingley returned to take Jane off our hands? Surely Mr. Collins has not jilted Miss Lucas and persuaded you to marry him after all?" Elizabeth feigned being unaffected by her father's taunt. To that day, she had failed to understand how her intimate friend from the neighbouring estate, Miss Charlotte Lucas, had accepted the hand of the very man whom Elizabeth found utterly ridiculous. Not willing to abandon her purpose, she cried, "Papa, pray be serious. Nothing on earth would ever persuade me to accept Mr. Collins. And as for Jane's prospects, no, Mr. Bingley has not returned. However, you cannot be unaware of how others view our family in the wake of what happened last month." Mr. Bennet peered over his spectacles at his daughter. "Since when do you care about the opinions of others so wholly unconnected with you?" Elizabeth shrugged. "Well, it's not so much that I care, but even you cannot be immune to others making sport of your family, or, heaven forbid, pitying us. Not only will this outing spread a bit of joy, but it will also remind everyone of what our family's about." Mr. Bennet rubbed his cheek. Making sport of his neighbours and laughing at them was the business of his life, but that did not mean he relished the thought of being the target of ridicule and caprice. Indeed, he had not done a single thing to shield his daughters from censure. As for living with regrets, he had assembled quite a stack of self-recriminations throughout the past couple of decades, all involving his neglect towards his family and toward their financial well-being in case of his death. He could have little doubt that were it not for Elizabeth, his family might not have given a thought to including him in the proposed scheme. Perhaps this once he could put aside his own proclivity. The tradition of regaling others was not one he had never heard of before. Earlier versions of carolling dated back to centuries ago, though not necessarily involving the Christmas season. Bennet could only suppose his favourite daughter learned of it through her extensive reading. She did not spend as much time immersed in books as she did for nothing. "Does this indeed mean that much to you, my dear?" Her eyes teeming with hope, Elizabeth nodded. "Then, by all means, gather the rest of the family. Let us all go out and spread tidings of comfort and joy to whosoever will receive them." Chapter 4. Boxing Day. Darcy climbed the stairs leading to the Hursts' home, as if he were bearing the weight of the world on his shoulder. Disguise of any sort had always been his abhorrence, yet there he was, having come face to face with the fact that he had been a sorry excuse for a friend to Charles Bingley. Darcy did not only successfully persuade Bingley that Miss Jane Bennet was not in love with him, he had also gone so far as to suggest that the young woman's family, specifically the mother, was mercenary. Darcy recalled his disgust at hearing Mrs. Bennet boast out loud of a pending wedding at Netherfield in 3 months. He recalled having taken it upon himself to examine Miss Bennet most studiously for the rest of the evening, looking for any real symptoms of affection she might suffer toward his friend. It was true the young lady bestowed the most angelic smiles one might imagine when speaking to his friend Charles, but so far as Darcy could tell, she smiled at everyone in that way. It was just in her nature. With no more evidence of the lady's affection than that to base his opinion upon, how was he to go along with the notion that the young woman genuinely cared for his friend? He could not. Darcy had argued that perhaps if the Bennet family were wealthy and well-connected, his friend would be quite fortunate to make such an advantageous match. Maybe if the mother and 3 younger sisters were not so uncouth. The more Darcy thought about it, the more he realised he had only made excuses, concocting objections that were of no real consequence to himself. Who was he to say whom his friend should or should not marry? He soon sat face to face with Bingley in the Hursts' drawing-room, pondering still how he might make amends for his officiousness. "Charles, I feel when you hear what I'm about to say, it will outrage you, and you will have every right to feel that way, my friend." "Well, Darcy, I cannot imagine being terribly angry with you for too long for any reason. You know how much I value your opinion." "That's the thing, Charles. I've done you a great disservice by injecting too much of my opinion on something that has little to nothing to do with me." Bingley's expression clouded. "What are you talking about, Darcy?" "You will recall asking me about Miss Jane Bennet, whether I thought she cares for you. The fact of the matter is, I should not have said what I said." "Are you saying that you think Miss Bennet likes me?" "No, I'm not saying that at all. What I am saying is that it does not matter what I think, it only matters what you think, Charles. Seeing you walking around in such malaise for the past several weeks, I'm persuaded that you ought to be the one to decide how the young lady feels about you. It makes no difference what others think. Not me, not your sisters, not anyone. I tell you this because I fear—" Nay, I know circumstances have conspired to keep you here in town under false pretences. Bingley nodded. As you know, I intended to return to Netherfield after the ball, just as I promised Miss Bennet I would. However, Caroline suggested that Miss Bennet was indifferent toward me. Your sister deliberately misled you into thinking that way, but that does not diminish my culpability. If I'm to be honest, I would have to tell you there is a reason I'm telling you about my role in keeping you and Miss Bennet apart. You see, I have my own motives. As you may or may not have surmised, I too found myself captivated by one of the Bennet daughters. Miss Elizabeth? Bingley said knowingly. Darcy laughed a little at his friend's supposition. He nodded. I wanted to be away from Hertfordshire in part, because of my unwillingness to accept my attraction to Miss Elizabeth. So much for her not being handsome enough to tempt you, Bingley said in the recollection of his friend's slight against the young lady when they first met. Of course Elizabeth tempted him. Of course she mattered to him. Whenever the two of them were in a room, Elizabeth was the only person he could see. She was the only person of the female persuasion who had ever stood up to him. This headstrong young woman with a light and pleasing figure had unknowingly done what no one had ever been able to. She made him feel alive. She aroused his curiosity. If he could pick a single word to describe his reaction to Miss Elizabeth Bennet, he would choose bewitched. Darcy had purposely provoked her whenever he could. To her credit, Elizabeth could give as good as she got, not only with him, but with most everyone she came across. How she had failed to see through George Wickham's lies and machinations, Darcy never understood. This bright and intelligent young woman proclaimed herself to be a studier of people's characters, yet, when comparing me to George Wickham, I am the one she considered wanting. Did Darcy ever have his work cut out for him in turning back the tide of Elizabeth's disdain for him? He could not help but consider the irony of his situation. It surely did not bode well for his cause that, in leaving Hertfordshire as he did, he had effectively conceded the field to his nemesis. Who was to say the manner of lies Wickham had spread against him since Darcy left? How ironic indeed if the woman who he had meant to escape had fallen for his worst enemy. The woman with whom Darcy had fallen in love. An unrequited love, yes, but he had to believe that would change. Bingley said, I cannot say that I'm not disappointed, but I'm not one to hold a grudge, especially knowing you sacrificed your own interests, behaving toward me as you acted toward yourself. Indeed, Bingley's disappointment in his friend was short-lived. Upon his suggestion that they ought to return to Hertfordshire, Darcy readily agreed. First, Bingley needed to speak with his sister Caroline. As there was no one else to summon his sister on that particular day, Bingley took on the task himself. He tapped on the door and told her about their guest from outside in the hallway. Just the mention of Darcy's name compelled the young woman to throw open the door, dash past her brother, and race down the stairs to the drawing-room. "Oh, Mr. Darcy!" she cried. "I did not expect to see you this morning. What a delightful surprise!" She sashayed to the part of the room where he stood, gazing out the window. "How long have you been waiting for me? Hopefully I did not keep you waiting too long," she cooed. Darcy tore his eyes from the window and turned to face the young woman, his manner questioning. Bingley merely rolled his eyes. "For heaven's sake, Caroline, Darcy is my guest," he scoffed. "The reason I asked you to join us has to do with alarming information I just received from Darcy. It concerns Miss Jane Bennet." "Miss Jane Bennet?" she said. "Why would I be interested in anything you have to say about that poor little creature?" "As you took it upon yourself to write to her, ostensibly on my behalf, I must have you tell me what you said." "What difference does it make now, what I may have said?" "It makes all the difference in the world to me, for I have every intention of returning to Hertfordshire, just as I promised her I would. Based on what Darcy told me, I suspect you may have given Miss Bennet a false impression of my intentions." "Well, if I did, surely you not returning is confirmation of your lack of intention, is it not?" "Though I must take full responsibility for what my behaviour has been, do not pretend you are not complicit in poisoning my mind against Miss Bennet." Caroline gasped. "Charles, how dare you blame me for your lack of constancy, especially knowing how fond I was of the young lady?" Darcy had had enough. Who knew better than him that all of Caroline's pretensions towards Miss Bennet toward all the Bennets, were fraught with disdain, ridicule, and scorn. His features hardened. "Pray give it a rest, Miss Bingley," he said. "I've told Charles everything." "Surely not everything?" A look of shock on her face and a hint of a challenge in her voice. "Everything," Darcy said. "That is to say, everything he knew of the scheme," Bingley said. "What I want to know is the extent of your part in it, Caroline. Pray, tell me you did not commit irreparable harm to my chances with Miss Bennet in your parting letter to her." The young lady shrugged. "I merely explained the reason for our leave-taking on the heels of the Netherfield ball." "Did you attempt to persuade Miss Bennet that I would not be returning as I'd promised?" "Perchance that is precisely what you told her, secure in your ability to keep me in town." Miss Bingley could not deny her brother's point. She and her sister Louisa had been most meticulous in wording the parting letter to Jane Bennet. She could still remember it to that day. "When my brother left us yesterday, he imagined that the business which took him to London might be concluded in 3 or 4 days. As we are certain it cannot be so, and at the same time convinced that when Charles gets to town he will be in no hurry to leave it again, we have determined on following him thither, that he may not be obliged to spend his vacant hours in a comfortless hotel. Many of my acquaintances are already there for the winter. I wish I could hear that you, my dearest friend, had any intention of making one of the crowd, but of that I despair. I sincerely hope that your Christmas in Hertfordshire may abound in the gaieties which that season generally brings, and that your beaux will be so numerous as to prevent you feeling the loss of the 3 of whom we shall deprive you." They were merely acting in their brother's best interest to the young lady's way of thinking. Charles was always falling in and out of love with so-called angelic creatures. They could have no reason to suspect his infatuation with Jane Bennet was any different from all the rest. Caroline did not mean to feel guilty or even to apologise. She most certainly did not mean to accept the blame for her brother's ensuing behaviour. She told him as much. "The material point is you did not return to Hertfordshire. Had I written otherwise, would that not have rendered my efforts insincere? You employed every means in your power to persuade me of Miss Bennet's indifference, and now you speak as though I ought to congratulate you." She waved a dismissive hand in the air. "Oh, Charles, how you go on! What is done is done. I say things turned out for the best. No good would have come from you aligning yourself with such a family." She threw a frustrated glance at Mr. Darcy. "Do not pretend you disagree with me. Was it not you who declared the Bennet sisters would never marry men of any consequence in the world? Was it not you who decided Jane Bennet's affection for my brother was lacking? What on earth compelled you to confess what happened now? Call it an awakening to the truth, if you will. Charles is more than capable of gauging for himself how a woman feels about him." The younger man nodded. "Indeed I am. That's why I've decided to return to Hertfordshire as soon as possible. Darcy and I will both be returning, and so will you, Caroline." "Me?" Caroline asked. "Why in the world would I do that?" "To preside over my table, of course. How else might my neighbours expect me to entertain?" "No!" she shouted. "No, I cannot. And I will not. Even if I were inclined to do so, which I most certainly am not, how can you expect me to leave London now? You know how much I've been looking forward to attending the 12th Night ball." Crossing her arms, she scoffed. "Wild horses would not drag me away from London at such a time of year as this, and the same goes for Louisa, I might add." Bingley could have no doubt his other sister would be just as adamant. The 2 ladies were inseparable. He combed his fingers through his unruly hair and commenced pacing the floor. After a moment or two, he halted his steps. "Very well, Caroline. If I cannot go to Miss Bennet, I shall have to find a way for her to come to me." "And are you thinking what I think you're thinking, Charles?" Darcy asked. Bingley nodded. "I am indeed." He trained his eyes squarely on his sister. "And you are going to help me?" "Me?" "Yes, Caroline, you." Chapter 5. One of Longbourn's servants entered the room bearing a letter in her hand. The young woman gave it to the eldest Bennet daughter, Jane. Jane's angelic countenance changed ever so slightly, and she made some excuse of needing to quit the room. Signalling her sister Elizabeth to follow her with a glance and a nod, Jane rose from her seat and escaped the room as quickly as possible. Seeing her sister's reaction, Elizabeth could not help recalling the last time Jane had received an early morning missive. Neither could she forget the pain receiving such a letter had wrought. Could this be yet another letter from Miss Caroline Bingley? Elizabeth wondered, trailing her sister down the hall and up the stairs to their apartment. If it were, Jane's not letting on the sender's name to the room's occupants made sense. Heaven forbid that Mrs. Bennet should learn that Mr. Bingley's sister had written to Jane again. Surely she would make far more of it than was necessary. As soon as she could, Elizabeth asked, "Jane, pray do not keep me in suspense. Who sent you a letter? Pray the sender is not Miss Bingley." "Indeed, Miss Bingley is the sender." Taking a seat on the bed, Jane tore open the seal and began reading the letter. After a few moments of sitting and watching and wondering, Elizabeth's patience reached its limit. "Jane, what on earth does the insidious Caroline Bingley mean in writing you a letter?" Jane handed the letter to her sister. Wanting to discuss it, she remained quiet while Elizabeth perused the page. "You will recall, my dearest friend, my having written to you in late November, and mentioning that many of my acquaintances were already in town for the winter, and expressing my wish that I could hear that you had some intention of making one of the crowd. As I have not heard a word from you in reply, I believe it's incumbent upon me to reach out to you again in that regard. I write specifically to ask if you will accompany me to the upcoming Twelfth Night ball. I assure you your presence is highly desired, not only by Mrs. Hurst and myself, but also by my brother. Written words cannot adequately convey the depth of his apology for not returning to Hertfordshire owing to matters beyond his control. I only hope the generosity you have always bestowed towards our family will be a favourable factor in your willingness to accept my invitation." Elizabeth's eyes opened wide. Disregarding the rest of the missive, she set it aside. "I hardly know what to make of this," she said. She could only suppose Miss Bingley had written a letter under duress, perhaps with the wrong end of a pistol aimed at her head. She shared her suspicion with her sister. Jane smiled. Although I can hardly give credence to your theory of how this letter came about, it seems Miss Bingley is most eager to resume our acquaintance." Retrieving and folding the missive, she said, "I rather suppose Caroline's affection for me has always been genuine. I'm the one who has been remiss in not writing to her as she must have been expecting. It is a cordial letter indeed, but somehow I cannot help but believe Caroline's motives are circumspect. Why on earth would you say such a thing? It's not as though she has any reason to extend such a charitable invitation to me." Elizabeth scoffed. "But what if she were indeed forced?" "What do you mean?" Elizabeth knew Caroline Bingley too well to suspect the pernicious young woman had had a complete change of heart in a matter of weeks. In her last letter to Jane, Miss Bingley made it abundantly clear what she thought of my sister as a potential suitor for her brother, as evidenced by her outlandish declaration of an alliance between him and Miss Georgiana Darcy. Not wishing to see her sister let her guard down where Caroline Bingley was concerned, Elizabeth shared her suspicion with Jane. What if Mr. Bingley learned of the contents of his sister's letter to you? What if he came to realise that she had insinuated that he had no plans to return, and then proceeded to thwart his intentions at every turn? Elizabeth scoffed again. Thoroughly persuaded by her own argument, she said, "No doubt this is precisely what happened, and he coerced Caroline into writing a letter to make amends. I know you never liked Miss Bingley, Lizzie, hence your lively speculations on her true motives. But even if what you say is true, I cannot say that's a bad thing." "That is because you believe the entire world is good, just like you. I dare say that Bingley's sister is indeed the exception. I've never trusted her, and I never will." "Even if what you are saying is true, and I'm not saying it is true, but supposing it is, the fact remains that she's invited me to accompany her to a Twelfth Night ball, which means Mr. Bingley will probably attend the ball as well." Jane smiled. "I shall once again be in Mr. Bingley's company. I, for one, cannot imagine a happier prospect." Placing her hand over her mouth to hide her smile, Elizabeth said, "Dearest Jane, you really do love Mr. Bingley." Her tone was equal parts questioning and declaring. "Though I was hesitant to confess it before receiving this invitation from his sister, I must admit that I have missed him terribly. I should like nothing more than to spend time again with him, even if it is only for one night at a masked ball." Elizabeth was happy for her sister. but she could not help but look concerned, considering her disdain for the sender. Seeing this, Jane said, "Oh, Lizzie, please do not look so worried." "Jane, you know how I feel about Miss Bingley. I cannot trust her any farther than I can throw her." Jane said, "Then there is only one way to put your concerns to rest." "Oh?" Elizabeth asked. "And what, pray tell, is that?" "Why, you must come with me, of course. We must both attend the 12th Night ball in town as Miss Bingley's guests." Elizabeth laughed a little at this suggestion. "You may easily persuade me to attend the ball with you, for who does not like a ball? There is only one problem." "And what is that?" Jane asked. "Well, Caroline Bingley invited you. She said nothing of you being able to invite someone on your own. As much as I enjoy the prospect of frustrating her at every turn, I do not think prevailing on her to allow me to tag along to a ball in London with her society friends is the best means for bringing that about. I shall insist upon you being invited too, as a condition for my accepting this invitation. If Caroline's motive for inviting me is genuine, she can hardly refuse. Come with us to town tomorrow, and I shall inform Caroline of both our being there, and my desire to have you join me as a condition for my going to the ball." Elizabeth could not argue with Jane's reasoning, and she readily agreed to the scheme. Persuading her aunt and uncle to allow her to go with them to town would be easy enough. Her London relations had often entertained the two sisters in town at the same time. Elizabeth's aunt, Mrs. Gardiner, did indeed embrace the scheme with pleasure when Jane and Elizabeth presented it to her later that day, as did Mr. Gardiner. It delighted them that Jane would have someone by her side who was close to her age, to partake in the upcoming season's various diversions. Mrs. Gardiner could only offer one warning. "We live in a different part of town. All our connections are so different, and as you well know, we go out so little that it's very improbable that Jane and her would-be suitor Mr. Charles Bingley should meet at all." Both Elizabeth and Jane were eager to correct that particular assumption on their aunt's part, with news of Miss Caroline Bingley's invitation to an upcoming 12th Night soirée, even if they were careful to avoid the intelligence reaching Mrs. Bennet's ears. Several days later, Jane and Elizabeth were sitting in the gardener's drawing-room when a missive in Miss Caroline Bingley's handwriting arrived. The part that immediately drew both sisters' eyes read, "Mr. Hurst, my sister Louisa and I shall arrive in our carriage at the appointed hour to bring you and your dear sister, Miss Eliza, to the ball." Jane was ecstatic, as was Elizabeth, but likely to a lesser extent. While there had been no specific mention of Mr. Bingley in any of the recent correspondence between Jane and Miss Bingley, Elizabeth suspected her sister was counting on the formidable reunion with her lover with bated breath. Although Jane seemed to suffer no ill feelings towards the Bingleys for the way they had treated her, Elizabeth could not forgive them so easily. Nor could she forgive the Bingleys' friend, Mr. Fitzwilliam Darcy, suspecting as she did that he too was complicit in Charles Bingley's neglect towards her sister. Elizabeth would never forget the disgusted look on his face the last time she saw him at the Netherfield ball, when he was forced to listen to her mother go on and on with unsubstantiated pontifications of the happiness that awaited Jane as the future mistress of Netherfield. Not that she blamed Mr. Darcy for his pained reaction to her mother's lack of decorum. Elizabeth herself had tried to temper her mother's outlandish conduct, but to no avail. She could, however, fault Mr. Darcy for what she suspected was his interference with Charles Bingley and Jane's budding romance. If she knew anything at all about Mr. Darcy, she knew him to be officious, haughty, and contemptible. She had proof enough of everything she suspected was wanting in him from his former friend, the amiable Lieutenant George Wickham, a gentleman whom Mr. Darcy had treated very poorly over the years. Elizabeth scoffed in the recollection of Caroline Bingley, of all people, attempting to caution her to be wary of anything Lieutenant Wickham had to say against Mr. Darcy. "So, Miss Eliza," the young lady had cried, "I hear that you're quite delighted with George Wickham. Your sister has been talking to me about him and asking me 1,000 questions. I find that the young man forgot to tell you, among his other communication, that he was the son of old Wickham, the late Mr. Darcy's steward. However, let me recommend you as a friend not to give implicit confidence to all his assertions, for as to Mr. Darcy's using him ill, it is perfectly false. He's always been remarkably kind to him. However, George Wickham has treated Mr. Darcy most infamously. I do not know the particulars, but I know very well that Mr. Darcy is not in the least to blame." "The audacity of that woman! Miss Bingley's warning was more than enough in persuading Elizabeth to give Mr. Wickham the benefit of the doubt. Cautioning words from Mr. Darcy himself also crossed her mind. Mr. Wickham is blessed with such happy manners as may ensure his making friends. Whether he may be equally capable of retaining them is less certain. That he had voiced his uncharitable opinion on the dance floor had also vexed her, even if she bore her fair share of the blame for provoking the haughty gentleman. Thoughts of Mr. Darcy brought a frown to Elizabeth's face. Since her arrival in town, she had spent more time thinking of Mr. Darcy than she would openly confess to anyone, even her sister Jane. How could she not? To that day she could not understand why he had singled her out for a dance at the Netherfield ball. He might have chosen from many other young ladies actually in want of his attention. Elizabeth knew he could not have done it because of her beauty. According to his own words, she was only tolerable and not handsome enough to tempt him. Did he merely mean to taunt me? It would not have been the first time, Elizabeth considered. The gentleman had displayed an odd penchant for engaging her in heated debates as well. That is to say, when he was not going out of his way to ignore me. Now alone in the bedroom she shared with Jane, whenever they were staying with their London relations, Elizabeth placed her hand under her chin while staring at her reflection in the mirror. Her thoughts of Mr. Darcy went unabated. I wonder if I shall see Mr. Darcy at the Twelfth Night ball. Should the fates conspire to put the two of us in each other's paths, will I once again find myself standing opposite him on the dance floor? She exhaled a frustrated breath. Whether she crossed paths with Mr. Darcy was of no real consequence to her. It was not every year that she would enjoy a Twelfth Night ball in London. Indeed, this was her very first. She planned to dance the night away. Still, part of her could not help but wonder if one of her dance partners might be Mr. Fitzwilliam Darcy. The other part of her could not help but wonder why it even mattered, the part that rebuked her for having a single care in the world about the haughty gentleman from Derbyshire. Chapter 6. Why, Miss Eliza, I do declare you have hardly attended a word being spoken to you. Pray, what is it that has your mind so busily engaged? What else must she be thinking, my dearest Louisa? Miss Bingley asked, thus ridding Elizabeth of the need to respond. I am certain that she has never attended a London ball before. No doubt she is quite overwhelmed by anticipation. Elizabeth feigned a half-smile and directed her gaze outside the carriage's window. How dreadful to be in the company of two of one's least favourite people in the world. But that was precisely the situation in which Elizabeth found herself. Making matters worse, her dearest Jane had yet to reunite with the amiable Mr. Bingley, a circumstance that was a mere carriage ride away from changing, for the Bingley sisters had spoken of how much their brother was looking forward to the night's festivities. The eldest had even hinted that he was particularly looking forward to seeing Jane again. For Elizabeth's part, she could not have been happier for her sister, and Jane's excitement shone over her angelic face. How characteristic of Jane's temperament that she was wearing a silver-coloured gown, its bodice etched in shiny white beads, which complemented the ones purposely woven throughout her locks. She appeared a celestial creature indeed. The livelier hues in Elizabeth's attire presented a striking, albeit fitting, contrast. As much as she loved her elder sister, the two were as different as night and day. Elizabeth always ascribed the best of motives to Jane, even if she thought her sister was a bit too naive. She knew herself to hold a more rational view of the world, one informed by her wide-ranging grasp of people's characters, even if she honed said expertise primarily through extensive reading. When at last they arrived at the ball, the first thing Elizabeth noticed upon looking around the crowded room was a sea of women drifting about. In her estimation, the women outnumbered the men by a margin of 5-1. Surely this imbalance among the sexes would not bode well for her scheme to dance the night away. It did not help that she didn't know anyone other than her party's members, a party boasting of only one gentleman, Louisa Hurst's husband, Randall Hurst. Never in all her time of knowing the gentleman did Elizabeth ever imagine him as a potential dance partner, but even he was starting to look good in her eyes. Then, too, there would be a chance to dance at least 2 sets with Mr. Bingley when at last he made an appearance at the ball. In Elizabeth's busy mind, thoughts of Mr. Bingley always led to thoughts of his friend, Mr. Darcy. Try as she might, she could not persuade herself to stop thinking of him, even if she was angry with him. She told herself that any animus she suffered towards him would have to be suppressed, at least for the evening. That was assuming he showed up. I dare not antagonize a potential dance partner on a night such as this. After the Bingley sisters made a slight show of introducing the Bennet sisters as their brothers' Hertfordshire neighbours to a handful of their London society friends, they seemed to wish to leave their guests to their own devices. Shortly after that, Jane and Elizabeth felt as though they were very much on their own. This suited Elizabeth's purposes perfectly well, except for one not so insignificant inconvenience, that being Jane's impatience to see Mr. Bingley, which caused Elizabeth to be impatient as well. When at last Mr. Charles Bingley had made his way through the thrall of party revellers, and now stood before the two Bennet sisters, Elizabeth could not say which of them was more pleased. Nothing made Elizabeth happier than seeing her sister's joy. Judging by the look on Jane's face, it appeared as though she and her lover had never parted. "Dearest Lizzie, I'm so happy with the way the evening is unfolding," Jane said when Charles Bingley excused himself to get punch for the two sisters. Elizabeth laughed a little. "I'm happy for you, my dear, although I must confess to feeling a little awkward standing here with the two of you." "Oh, pray do not," Jane cried. "If you are miserable, then I shall feel guilty. I insisted you accompany me after all." "Oh, do not let me interfere with your felicity, Jane. You and your Mr. Bingley have united once again. From what I can tell, he is just as much in love with you as ever before." Jane's eyes lit up, and it had nothing to do with her sister's assertion. The sound of a gentleman clearing his throat prompted Elizabeth to turn away from her sister. There stood Charles Bingley, bearing a cup of punch in his hand. He was not alone. Mr. Darcy stood directly beside him, holding a cup of punch in his hand as well. Elizabeth's heart banged against her chest. She had not realized the latter was in attendance at the ball. At that moment, she did not know which sentiment best described her composure, awkwardness or astonishment. Did Mr. Darcy hear me tell Jane that Mr. Bingley was just as much in love with her as ever? He must consider me no different from mamma, scheming and presumptuous. How will he behave? Will he drag his friend away from the ball to protect him from the likes of the lowly Bennets, as I suspect he did when they were in Hertfordshire? "Miss Elizabeth," said Mr. Darcy with a slight bow. He offered her the cup of punch he was holding. "I understand from my friend Bingley that you were parched and in want of refreshment. I hope this beverage suits." Elizabeth almost gasped. This was anything but the reaction from him she expected. She nodded and curtsied, and then accepted the proffered drink. "Thank you, Mr. Darcy," she said. She immediately took a sip and watched in amazement at the cordial manner in which Mr. Darcy greeted her sister Jane. He then directed his attention back to Elizabeth. Darcy had waited patiently for Miss Bingley to abandon the Bennet sisters' sides before approaching them that evening. The last thing in the world he wanted was to be accosted by Bingley's sister. Indeed, the gentleman had gone out of his way to be evasive whenever she broached the question of his being there that evening, especially given his general suspicion that she intended for them to wear coordinated outfits. Tonight was the night he meant to begin his ardent pursuit of Miss Elizabeth Bennet. Miss Bingley lurking about would only hamper his efforts. As for Bingley's late arrival, it was owing to a case of nerves. This was his first time seeing Miss Jane Bennet since they parted at the Netherfield ball, when he had promised her he would return from London in 3 days. Indeed, Darcy had spent a good part of the evening with a young man pacing the floor earlier at Darcy House. Bingley's guilt compounded his fears that Miss Bennet might suffer some ill will toward him for not keeping his word. How ironic the situation was for Darcy. After spending weeks trying to convince his friend of the young woman's indifference, he now found himself doing his best to persuade Bingley of her kind-heartedness and generosity of spirit. He argued it simply was not in the young lady's nature to harbour such a grudge. Finally reunited with a woman who unknowingly had stolen his own heart, Darcy's interest in Bingley's love life was the least of his concerns. Donned in an alluring scarlet-coloured gown, Miss Elizabeth Bennet was a sight to behold. Those bewitching dark eyes that haunted his dreams nearly stole his breath away. Those same eyes now stared at him questioningly. "I pray that you are having a pleasant evening, Miss Elizabeth." "Quite, Mr. Darcy." "I'm pleased to hear that. Bingley found me in the billiards room and gave me the strongest hint of your being slightly bored. I'm glad to know that this is not the case, for no young lady ought to suffer such a fate at a ball." Elizabeth did not know how to think about this version of Mr. Darcy standing next to her. If she did not know better, she would have sworn the haughty gentleman was flirting. That, or making fun of her. What a peculiar way he had of confounding her at every turn. It certainly did not go unnoticed that he was as handsome and noble as ever. Many of the gentlemen strolling about the room had heeded the occasion's permission to toss fashion sense to the wind in favour of assorted gay apparel. Mr. Darcy sported no such ornate adornment. He wore a stark black suit and a crisp white shirt and cravat. Elizabeth supposed the dark crimson, impeccably tailored waistcoat he wore was Mr. Darcy's nod to the occasion. He did of course have the requisite mask for the event. As they spoke, he held it to his face, effectively concealing his identity from the hordes of young ladies promenading about the assemblage. "Heaven forbid," Elizabeth replied, holding her mask before her face. "I recall your once pointing out the best way of encouraging affection is dancing. If your feelings on the subject have not changed, I must ask you, Miss Elizabeth, may I have this next dance?" Elizabeth's breath caught in her chest. Mr. Darcy really was flirting with her. His talk of encouraging affection aside, of course she wanted to dance. But what did he mean by saying such a thing, and in so doing, reminding her of their somewhat antagonistic past? Before she could think about it too much, she had handed over her cup of punch to a passing waiter and accepted Mr. Darcy's outstretched hand. She followed him onto the crowded ballroom floor. They danced 2 sets, and when the time came for them to part, Elizabeth started scanning the crowded room. "Are you looking for someone, Miss Elizabeth?" "I fear I've lost sight of my sister." Elizabeth stood on her tiptoes to command a better view. "I believe I ought to go in search of her." "Wherever she is no doubt in company with Bingley. You need not worry on that account, for I'm sure she is safe with him. However, if you were to go off in search of Miss Bennet amid this crush, unaccompanied, I cannot vouch for my own peace of mind." "Far be it from me to make you suffer on my account," Elizabeth said. "Then that settles it. You shall remain by my side until we happen upon your sister and my friend. Supposing the two of us were something more than indifferent acquaintances, your proposal would be quite sound," she said. Never mind that she was drowning amid a sea of virtual strangers. Other than Mr. Darcy and Mr. Bingley, Elizabeth knew no one other than those in her arrival party. She had hardly attended the earlier introductions to the Bingley sisters' acquaintances. People of that ilk meant nothing to her. Mr. Darcy clutched his hand to his chest. "You wound me, Miss Elizabeth, for I consider the two of us to be anything but indifferent toward each other." "I beg your pardon, sir," Elizabeth said. Mr. Darcy availed himself of 2 flutes of champagne from an attending waiter. Handing one to his companion, he inquired, "May I be frank with you, Miss Elizabeth?" "By all means, sir," she said. "I suppose it ought not to surprise me that you harbour some indifference toward me, Miss Elizabeth." "Well, no, there is no point in denying it," Mr. Darcy interrupted, half serious, half in jest. "It must certainly be true. It is not as though I went out of my way to earn everyone's good opinion in Hertfordshire. I might cite any number of reasons to explain myself, the most glaring being that I simply did not care to give myself the trouble." He finished his drink and placed his empty glass on the passing server's tray. "I have been a selfish being all my life, in practice, though not in principle. As a child I was taught what was right. I was given good principles, but left to follow them in pride and conceit. As an only son, and for many years an only child, I was spoiled by my parents, who, though good themselves, allowed, encouraged, almost taught me to be selfish and overbearing, and to care for none beyond my own family circle. I have long thought meanly of all the rest of the world, of others' sense and worth compared with my own." Standing straight and tall, with one hand behind his back, Mr. Darcy continued, "However I've been taught, and however I've been, I stand before you now a man resolved on charting a different path in life. One bent on being a better man. One capable of pleasing a woman worthy of being pleased. A woman such as yourself." Mr. Darcy leaned ever so close to Elizabeth, and spoke in a manner for her ears only. "And it is for that reason I'm professing my intention to woo you, Miss Elizabeth. to make you fall madly in love with me, and to make you my wife." Elizabeth, who was taking a sip of champagne, nearly choked on it. Her heart slammed against her chest, her mouth fell open. Never in the history of their acquaintance had Mr. Darcy spoken so eloquently and with such passion. How could she not be enthralled when he was speaking to her that way, looking at her that way? As engaged as she was in such riveting intercourse with a gentleman, she had not paid attention to the fact that he had escorted her outside the house into the garden. With just as many partygoers wandering about outside as inside, the flaunting of convention seemed the order of the evening. "Mr. Darcy, you are very bold. That said, I cannot deny that I'm intrigued by your proposal. But how can I be certain it's not the mystique of Twelfth Night causing you to speak this way?" Smiling a little, he stole a glance into the distance. "Ah, Twelfth Night! A magical night of whimsy and pretence." He gazed upon Elizabeth once more. "Indeed," she said, "a night where reckless behaviour is more of a rule rather than the exception, or so I've been led to believe." Once again she relied on her love of reading in making such a declaration. "Why should I believe a word you say?" He had summoned the courage to place his heart on the line, and this was to be her response? How could he fault her? There was a mixture of sweetness and archness in her manner that made it difficult for him to take offence. Determined to press his suit, Mr. Darcy said, "Believe me when I say that you have bewitched me as no other woman has ever done before." Elizabeth's heartbeat raced. Composing herself, she asked, "Am I to surmise there have been many such bewitching women in your life, sir?" He shrugged. "I would not say that." "What would you say?" Elizabeth asked, smiling at the imposing gentleman standing before her. What a striking contrast to his behaviour in Hertfordshire, when she was sure he only ever looked at her to find fault. "I say whether there has been 1, 2, or even a dozen, I am certain that there will never be another woman other than you ever again. Which means you absolutely must consider my suit and save me from being a lonely man for the rest of my days." Elizabeth's opinion of Mr. Darcy had been long in the making. It was not likely to be assuaged by well-spoken, honey-coated words, even if she felt her heart melting inside with each passing minute. Refusing to regard his assertions with a measure of seriousness such as the discourse otherwise portended, Elizabeth deflected, "In the occasion's spirit, what say you if I pretend to believe you?" "I say that as long as we're pretending, we might as well behave as lovers do on an evening such as this," said Mr. Darcy. "Oh," Elizabeth softly exclaimed. "Pray tell me, Mr. Darcy, how should lovers behave on such an evening as this?" she asked, her voice a mixture of playfulness and intrigue. "I could tell you," he said, leaning close enough for his warm breath to caress her face. "However, I would much rather show you, Miss Elizabeth." He whispered in her ear, "Take my hand." He seized her gloved hand in his, leaving her no choice but to heed his command. "Walk with me." Tucking her hand in the fold of his arm, Mr. Darcy led Elizabeth along a path perfectly suited to his purposes. Not that they were the only couple in the immediate vicinity of her mind for such assignations. It was Twelfth Night, after all. No one knew who anyone was with certainty. No one cared. "Where are you leading me, sir?" He placed a finger to his lips and hushed her. At length they came upon a cosy little alcove, affording an unobstructed view of the night-time sky. The stars shone as brightly as the eyes could see. Elizabeth recognized this place intuitively, yet another consequence of the constant improvement of her mind through extensive reading, of romantic novels especially, in this notable instance. Here she was, with undoubtedly one of the most handsome gentlemen of her acquaintance. Even if he was not her favourite, she had no reason to suppose he might never be. Already the ill will she felt towards him at the start of the evening was melting like icicle-laden tree branches under the bright sun on a winter's day. The ardent avowal of his intentions could only encourage. Added to that, Mr. Darcy smelled as good as he looked. The essence of sandalwood and spices flooded her senses. What on earth had she done to earn this man's good opinion? Whatever it was, surely it had been most unconsciously done. The very thought of being alone with Mr. Darcy in that instant made Elizabeth tremble. This he must have regarded as her being chilled. He was not entirely wrong. "It is cold," she said. "Of course it is, Miss Elizabeth. What was I thinking in leading you here?" Mr. Darcy removed his coat with haste and placed it about her shoulders. His hands resting on either lapel, he drew them close together. "Does this feel better?" Their gazes locked. As if against her will, Elizabeth moistened her lower lip. Her heartbeat thumping in her chest drowned out every thought. She said nothing. Mr. Darcy leaned closer. He whispered in her ear, "Would you repeat that, Miss Elizabeth? I seem to be hard of hearing." His warm breath caressed her skin. Before Elizabeth could fashion a response to his teasing, his soft lips brushed along her chin. The corner of her mouth, her lips, her first kiss ever. If ever there was a perfect night for a first kiss, this assuredly was it. And oh, what a kiss it was, especially as she realized she was kissing him right back. Chapter 7. Owing to their aunt Mrs. Gardiner's keen understanding, Elizabeth and Jane did not awaken before midday. They would never have enjoyed such liberty if they were at Longbourn. Their mother would have rallied them from their beds with unending inquiries of how the previous night had unfolded. What a relief indeed for Elizabeth especially, for she had yet to fathom how she could have spent the better part of the evening being wooed by Mr. Fitzwilliam Darcy. She could hardly countenance, much less explain, such an inexplicable prospect. Making matters worse, Elizabeth had the audacity to dream of the haughty gentleman, no doubt a consequence of having drifted off to sleep, remembering the lingering touch of his lips upon hers. "My utter dislike of Mr. Darcy has been months in the making, has it not? Pray, what on earth was I thinking in allowing him such liberties? Not once during our time in Hertfordshire did Mr. Darcy venture beyond the bounds of propriety. Indeed, I was absolutely persuaded he only ever looked at me to find fault. And yet last night found the two of us in each other's arms." She threw the bedcovers over her head and flailed her arms and legs in silent protest. "Dearest Lizzie," Jane said, sitting up in her bed across from her sisters. Elizabeth peeked from under the covers. "You're awake. I hope I didn't disturb your slumber." "Oh, no. I've been awake for a while. I've been waiting for you to open your eyes. Did you sleep well?" Jane asked. "As well as one might expect after such a night." The younger sister sat up in bed and, resting her head on her hand, gave Jane her full attention. "No doubt you're eager to regale me with talk of the handsome Mr. Bingley." Jane's countenance overspread with the brightest, most angelic glow. "I do not know when I have ever had so much fun at a ball," she started, speaking at length of all she had enjoyed the night before, much to Elizabeth's delight. Oh, to see her sister so happy after the general discontent she had suffered since the Netherfield party left Hertfordshire. Surely it's a matter of weeks, if not days, before Jane's happiness is complete. All talk on the subject of Jane and her Mr. Bingley once exhausted, Jane said, "Now that I think of it, I recall our being apart for quite some time. I suppose you were with Mr. Darcy, were you not?" Elizabeth half smiled. She said nothing. Jane threw her sister a curious glance. "What was that look, Lizzie? Pray the two of you did not have cross words." "Not exactly. I suppose that is a consolation of sorts. I know how much you dislike the gentleman." Elizabeth stared off into the distance. "Hence my dilemma," she silently considered. "Well, do not keep me in suspense," Jane said. "What would you have me say?" "Oh, you must tell me how things unfolded between the two of you. Are your feelings toward Mr. Darcy the same as they ever were, or perchance something has changed between the two of you?" "I'm afraid there's not much to tell. We danced, we talked, we walked," Elizabeth did not say aloud. We kiss. She swallowed hard and shrugged. "As I said, there was not much to entertain." "Why do I feel as though you're being evasive?" "Oh, Jane, have you never heard the saying, 'What happens at a Twelfth Night ball stays at a Twelfth Night ball'?" Elizabeth asked. desirous of changing the subject. The older sister frowned. "I'm quite certain I never have. Is that really such a saying?" Elizabeth half laughed. "If not, I posit it ought to be." The very next day, Elizabeth spoke in a similar vein with none other than Mr. Darcy himself. To Jane's delight, Mr. Bingley called on her early that morning. His friend Mr. Darcy accompanied him, much to Elizabeth's dismay. Bingley had suggested a walk in the nearby park. Before long, he and Jane had far outpaced Elizabeth and Darcy, no doubt by design. Mr. Darcy, it seemed, was eager to pick up where he had left off with Elizabeth when they were last together. Elizabeth interrupted him. "Have you never heard the adage that what happens at Twelfth Night balls stays at Twelfth Night balls?" "I cannot say that I have." "Funny. Jane says the same thing as you. However, I'm all but certain it is a commonly held belief. And if it's not, then it ought to be." "Miss Elizabeth, I'm more than happy to pretend that you and I did not share our first kiss at the ball, for that means you and I have yet another first kiss to look forward to." She scoffed. "Another 12 months hence, perhaps?" "Oh, if that's as long as it takes. I would rather prefer it was sooner than that," Mr. Darcy replied. Stopping and taking Elizabeth's hand in his, he removed her glove and brought her hand to his lips. "Much, much sooner," he said, gazing into her eyes. The stirring deep down inside that she had tried hard to suppress since he first kissed her overtook Elizabeth with a vengeance. She seized her glove from the gentleman and put it back on. "Though suspending your pleasure is akin to suspending my own, Mr. Darcy, I'm afraid I have no choice but to do just that." "I wish you would not speak that way." "I fear I must. You and I hardly know each other." "Have you and I not known each other just as long as your sister and my friend? I recall you telling her at the ball how much Bingley loves her." "I am not Jane, and you, sir, are no Mr. Bingley." "I'm not sure how I ought to take that, Miss Elizabeth." "I'm not saying that as a rebuke. Mr. Bingley's affection for my sister has been on display for everyone to see from the moment he first laid eyes on her," Elizabeth said. "Now surely you cannot say the same as regards any affection you might suffer towards me." "What I will say is this. It was not long after meeting you that I realized I was in grave danger of falling in love with you. You invoked sentiments deep inside of me that I scarcely allowed myself to admit to anyone. Now that I've admitted it to myself, there is no turning back." "I'm afraid it's not as simple as that for me, sir. Until recently, I'm sure I never really liked you." "Until recently?" Mr. Darcy asked. "Then you were saying you recently began to like me. Seeing that, including today, we've only been in each other's company twice recently. I would say I am making considerable progress. By my calculation, you and I will share our first kiss in weeks, if not days." "If only it were that simple," Elizabeth said. "What must I do to persuade you over to my view of things?" "Sir, as much as I suspect you had a part to play in the happy reunion between my sister and your friend Mr. Bingley, I cannot say that I do not have other provocations that oblige me to regard you with circumspect." "Other provocations?" Mr. Darcy asked, arching his brow and wondering to what Elizabeth might be referring. Then it dawned on him, their last time being together at Netherfield, when she had insinuated some malice on his part toward that dastardly George Wickham. His mind wandered to that precise moment on the dance floor when he asked her if she and her sisters often walked to Meryton. She had answered in the affirmative, and, as though unable to resist the temptation, added, "When you met us there the other day, we had just been forming a new acquaintance." The effect on Mr. Darcy was immediate, nearly robbing him of his speech. At length he spoke in a constrained manner. "Mr. Wickham is blessed with such happy manners as may ensure his making friends. Whether he may be equally capable of retaining them is less certain. He has been so unlucky as to lose your friendship, and in a manner which he is likely to suffer from all his life," had been Elizabeth's reply, in a tone suggesting she knew something that Mr. Darcy might have wished she did not know. Who is to say to what lengths Wickham might have gone to poison Elizabeth's mind against me? Mr. Darcy wondered, recalling himself to the present. He attempted to affect a coolness he did not genuinely feel. The last thing he wanted was to waste precious moments with Elizabeth discussing the lights of George Wickham. Elizabeth said, "I see by your expression that you know precisely of what I speak." No doubt you're speaking of George Wickham. His account of your behaviour towards him paints you in the worst possible light. Pray, let us not ruin this moment with talk of that gentleman. Why ever not, Mr. Darcy? Can you deny that you have reduced him to his present state of poverty, comparative poverty? Do you deny that you have withheld the advantages that you must know were designed for him? In so doing, you have deprived the best years of his life of that independence which was no less his due than his just reward. It pains me knowing you give such credit to Wickham's assertions. How might I easily discount them, when you have yet to offer your own defence? You dislike the gentleman, but you'll not explain your reasoning. I have a specific reason for feeling towards George Wickham as I do, one I'm not at liberty to discuss with anyone out of fear of violating trust with someone very close to me. I cannot prevent you from believing his accusations against me, but I pray that you will not. Trust me, there are far more people who will vouch for my good character than he might ever wish to boast of. Elizabeth said nothing, which was sufficient encouragement for the gentleman to continue. Think about it, Mr. Darcy said. Would you share scurrilous, unsubstantiated claims against another with so little provocation as a willing smile? How can I argue Mr. Darcy on this point? Elizabeth asked herself. Pleased with Mr. Wickham's flattery and displeased by Mr. Darcy's insult, Elizabeth had courted prepossession and ignorance, the same frailties she had accused her companion of in his rush to judge her sister's affections for his friend Charles Bingley. Elizabeth liked to think of herself as a fair-minded person. How could she not accept Mr. Darcy's proposal in the spirit with which he gave it and agree to start anew? Besides, were she to be honest with herself, she would have to confess that the events between them in the moonlight during the Twelfth Night ball had placed the odds decidedly in Mr. Darcy's favour. Chapter 8. By now, spending time with Mr. Bingley and Mr. Darcy was the Bennet sisters' daily occupation. The gentleman had even dined at the gardener's humble abode in Cheapside one evening. While Elizabeth was hesitant to surrender her own heart to her suitor Mr. Darcy, it pleased her knowing no such hesitance existed on Jane's part. Hence, Elizabeth could hardly complain about her current company, gathered about Mr. and Mrs. Hurst's dining table. At the speed at which Jane and Bingley's romance is progressing, my Jane is well on the way to being a sister to the pernicious Bingley sisters. Like it or not, I shall find myself in similar situations like the present for the rest of my life, sitting across the dining table with one of my least favourite people in the world, Miss Caroline Bingley. Elizabeth could not be too disappointed with the company she was keeping. Her uncle and aunt, Mr. and Mrs. Gardiner, were present. Elizabeth was sure she had Mr. Bingley to thank for such a courtesy. His sisters thought much too highly of themselves to entertain people with connections to trade, despite its having been the means of bringing about their own family's fortune. It came as no surprise to Elizabeth to see Mr. Darcy there too. But what had surprised her was his young sister Miss Georgiana Darcy's presence. With her fair complexion and angelic eyes, the young woman's likeness to Jane was uncanny. On that particular evening, Jane's countenance was positively radiant. Elizabeth immediately understood its means of being there when Mr. Bingley arose from the table and shared his joyous news with the rest of the party. He asked Jane to be his wife, and she accepted. What joyful news indeed! Is he someone with whom I can spend the rest of my life? Such was the question posed to herself in the drawing-room later that evening. Seeing Mr. Darcy standing on the other side of the room conversing with her uncle Mr. Gardiner, Elizabeth thought about her aunt Mrs. Gardiner's accolades upon first making the young man's acquaintance at her relations' home a week ago. There is something pleasing about his mouth when he speaks, and there is something of dignity in his countenance that would not give one an unfavourable idea of his heart. Astounded, Elizabeth stood there and stared. How very odd it was observing Mr. Darcy behaving so cordially with one of her relations now, when his general comportment towards her Hertfordshire relations had been anything but congenial. She recalled the silent indignation on his face at the gathering at Lucas Lodge, when her younger sisters fluttered around the room and dared to cajole everyone into dancing. Then there was the time when her mother and 3 younger sisters came to Netherfield during Jane's convalescence. That was but the first time Elizabeth, of all people, had found it necessary to speak in Mr. Darcy's defence, after her mother had compared him to Mr. Bingley, over some discussion on the country's merits no less, and while praising the latter, she had effectively declared the former wanting. Finally, there was her mother's behaviour at supper during the Netherfield ball. If only her mother and younger sisters had been the only cause for concern on Elizabeth's part, but even her father's conduct was uncouth. When her mother contrived to be the last among the guests to quit the ball, Elizabeth's mortification was all but complete. She was sure that Mr. Darcy was even more mortified. Her relation's behaviour appalled him. He had used his disgust to justify interfering in Jane's budding romance with his friend Bingley. Can this be the same Mr. Darcy who garnered so much disapprobation on my part? Part of Elizabeth had been secretly searching for a reason to trust this man. What sensible young woman does not relish the prospect of having someone with whom she can trust her heart? Someone to have and to hold? Someone with whom she can fall in love? Elizabeth had already rejected the hand of one man, but how could she not? The man was a fool. Say what one will about Mr. Darcy, but he's no fool. Proud and haughty, yes. Is the gentleman conversing with my uncle the true Mr. Darcy? Is he merely putting on a pretence for my sake? Mr. Darcy has all but professed his love for me. He vowed to court me, to make me fall in love with him, to marry me. The very thought of their past intimacies at the Twelfth Night ball made her stomach turn somersaults. Since then, he had been nothing if not the consummate gentleman. Still, nothing would subdue the stirring she felt whenever she was near him. Elizabeth's heart slammed against her chest when Mr. Darcy chose that exact moment to tear his eyes away from her uncle and look her way. Does he know I'm thinking of him? His gaze made her tremble inside. She half smiled and looked away, just in time to espy Miss Darcy heading in her direction. When they were standing face to face, the younger woman smiled. "May I prevail on you for a turn around the room, Miss Elizabeth?" How fortuitous a turn of events for Elizabeth. A private tête-à-tête with Miss Darcy was precisely what she was hoping for at some point that evening. When Bingley announced his engagement to Jane during dinner earlier, Elizabeth had studied everyone's face to gauge their reactions, especially Mr. Darcy's. His rarely bestowed smile eased her mind considerably. Upon diverting her eyes to the others at the table, it surprised her to see that one member of their party was even more disappointed than Bingley's sister Caroline, that being Miss Darcy. Thoughts of Caroline Bingley's words in her parting letter to Jane last November could not help but intrude. Mr. Darcy is impatient to see his sister, and, to confess the truth, we are scarcely less eager to meet her again. I really do not think that Georgiana Darcy has her equal for beauty, elegance, and accomplishments. The affection she inspires in Louisa and me is heightened into something still more interesting from the hope we dare entertain of her being hereafter our sister. I do not know whether I ever before mentioned to you my feelings on this subject, but I will not leave the country without confiding them, and I trust that you will not esteem them unreasonable. My brother admires her greatly already. He will have frequent opportunity now of seeing her on the most intimate footing. Her relations all wish the connection as much as his own, and a sister's partiality is not misleading me, I think, when I call Charles most capable of engaging any woman's heart. With all these circumstances to favour an attachment, and nothing to prevent it, am I wrong, my dearest Jane, in indulging the hope of an event which will secure the happiness of so many? Elizabeth could not help thinking at the time that Caroline's words were merely the product of her own misguided thinking. Seeing Miss Darcy's face at the dinner table earlier really gave Elizabeth pause. Did the young girl truly entertain hopes of a union with Mr. Bingley? Elizabeth thought back to her initial surprise at meeting Miss Darcy at the start of the evening. Relying upon George Wickham's account that she was just as proud as her brother, Elizabeth had expected to be unimpressed to meet the purportedly haughty young heiress. With some astonishment, Elizabeth saw that her new acquaintance was nothing at all as Mr. Wickham had described. Indeed, the observation of a very few minutes convinced her that Miss Darcy was only exceedingly shy. Upon having seen firsthand the disgust on the young lady's face in the wake of Mr. Bingley and Jane's happy news, Elizabeth was tempted to rebuke herself for having questioned Mr. Wickham's judgment. Before I totally discredit my own understanding, I ought to give Miss Darcy the benefit of the doubt. Perhaps there is another explanation for her dour expression at dinner. I shall wait to see how she behaves, and then I shall know how to feel. I shall be delighted, Miss Darcy, Elizabeth said smilingly. They walked to a less crowded part of the room. At length, Miss Darcy said, I suppose I ought to congratulate you and your family on your good fortune. On behalf of my sister, I thank you for your kind words. I am sure it's not every day that someone from your sphere meets with such an advantageous alliance." "I beg your pardon?" Elizabeth asked, almost missing a step. "From what I'm told, your family lacks fortune and connection, and yet your sister now finds herself engaged to marry a gentleman of some consequence." She scoffed. "What are the chances?" Miss Darcy asked, almost indignantly for someone so young. Elizabeth would have relished the opportunity to argue her sister's case with Miss Darcy's brother. She expected such boorishness from him. She never expected his sister, who was no more than 16, to speak with such frankness. Instead, she said, "How fortunate for my sister to have met a man of consequence who does not judge others based on their wealth and connections. I suppose you have a point. In that regard, Mr. Bingley stands in stark contrast to my brother, which is indeed a relief. Why, every single one of my family would suffer a fit of apoplexy were my brother to make such a disadvantageous alliance." "Is Miss Darcy's speech meant for me?" Elizabeth wondered. "I mean no offence," Miss Darcy said. "I'm sure your sister and Mr. Bingley will be quite happy. I dare say society will not look askance on his choice of a wife, despite her lack of fortune, especially given the source of his own fortune. My brother would not so easily escape such censure. What with his being the grandson of an earl and the master of one of the grandest estates in Derbyshire, only a wealthy heiress in her own right would likely garner his attention. I dare not speak for your brother, except to posit perhaps you do not know him so well as you think you do. I confess one cannot ever really know the true character of another, but as his closest living relation on earth, I would posit I know him better than anyone else does. While he and Mr. Bingley are the best of friends, there is such a vast disparity in their characters and their sense of their place in society as to persuade me that my brother will behave in accordance with his expectations." Being the older of the two, Elizabeth had tried her best not to return the young lady's sentiments tit for tat. Besides, what would Mr. Darcy think of her if she employed such silly antics? Whereas it might tempt him to make excuses for his sister, who was more than a decade his junior, he likely would not afford such leniency towards a potential love interest or even a future wife. Where is this coming from? The young lady had been perfectly civil when she and Elizabeth met earlier in the evening. It was as though she looked forward to making Elizabeth's acquaintance, giving the older of the two cause to wonder what Mr. Darcy might have said to encourage such a reception. "It stunned me to learn of Mr. Wickham's being in Hertfordshire," Miss Darcy said, piercing Elizabeth's thoughts. "My brother did not mention a word of his being there." Knowing how much Mr. Darcy despised Wickham, Elizabeth hardly knew what to say. Surely this was not the time to introduce the subject. "Mr. Wickham enlisted in the militia and camped just outside of Meryton. And he is a favourite of yours, I understand. How interesting." Elizabeth suspected she heard a hint of jealousy in Miss Darcy's tone. But how can that possibly be? Elizabeth's mind wandered to a topic at the dinner table, during which Miss Bingley had brought up Wickham's name. Though Mr. Wickham has long been a favourite of the Bennet family, Miss Eliza's in particular, I could never quite understand why. I suppose it must be the sight of a man in a scarlet coat that offers such appeal. Elizabeth frowned. Does Miss Darcy view me as a contender for Mr. Wickham's affections? Can this be the reason for the young lady's change in attitude? It was now absolutely necessary to address Mr. Darcy's opinion of the gentleman with the young woman by her side. Pardon me, but I know very well that Mr. Wickham has been most unfortunate as to lose Mr. Darcy's good opinion. Cannot the same be said of your own? You seem pretty well informed of my brother's relationship with Mr. Wickham. I doubt my brother willingly discussed such matters, which means Mr. Wickham himself is the source of your intelligence. Pray, what did he have to say about me? Sentiments I dare not repeat, Elizabeth surmised, recalling his exact words when she specifically asked him what sort of girl Miss Darcy was. I wish I could call her amiable. It gives me pain to speak ill of a Darcy, but she is too much like her brother. Very, very proud. As a child she was affectionate and pleasing and extremely fond of me, and I have devoted hours and hours to her amusement. But she is nothing to me now. For your sake, I sincerely hope you're not nursing a broken heart for Mr. Wickham, Elizabeth thought, but did not say as the gentleman's harsh words echoed in her mind. She is too much like her brother. very, very proud. As for refuting the younger woman's belief that Mr. Wickham was a particular favourite, Elizabeth could say nothing to the contrary, for she had not taught herself to dislike him, even if the gentleman who was courting her despised him. Miss Darcy seemed to expect an answer to the question she posed about Wickham, but Elizabeth had no words to offer in that regard either. As fate would have it, she needed none. Mr. Darcy approached the two ladies. "As pleased as I am to see the two of you getting along, I'm afraid I must interrupt you." He turned to his sister. "Georgiana, the carriage to take Mrs. Annesley and you home is ready." "Oh, but Miss Elizabeth and I were just getting to know each other. Might I stay a while longer?" "Not this evening," Mr. Darcy said. "Fear not, for if things go as I hope, you shall have ample time to get better acquainted with Miss Elizabeth." While he was speaking to his sister, he intended his words for Elizabeth. His piercing gaze rested on her face. Miss Darcy protested no more. "Miss Elizabeth," she said, "it has been a pleasure." With a slight curtsy, she was gone directly. After being in company for so many hours, it was now Mr. Darcy's turn to spend time alone with Elizabeth. That is, as alone as two people who had not publicly declared their intentions toward each other to the world could, while surrounded by family and other acquaintances. How Mr. Darcy wanted that night to be the night he officially proposed to Elizabeth. He knew better than to do so on the heels of Bingley's proposal to Miss Bennet, the timing of which had caught him by surprise. He knew Elizabeth too well to suppose it would please her to rob her sister of her full share of attention. "I hope you enjoyed a lovely conversation with my sister," he said. "Indeed," Elizabeth replied. "It was most enlightening, to say the least." He thought he detected a hint of displeasure in Elizabeth's tone. "Enlightening in a good way, I hope," he said, his hands tucked neatly behind his back for fear of wanting to capture hers. "Miss Darcy has the highest opinion of you, sir," Elizabeth said. "I believe she's rather protective of you as well." He nodded. "One might say Georgiana looks to me as more of a father than as an elder brother, a consequence of my being more than a decade her senior and her guardian, owing to both our parents' passing. There is nothing I would not do for her. She means the world to me." A shrieking voice rang out from across the room, piercing Mr. Darcy's bliss of having Elizabeth all to himself. Before he knew what he was about, Miss Caroline Bingley was heading their way. Too late to turn and head in the opposite direction, Mr. Darcy and Elizabeth halted in their steps and awaited the unwanted third party's intrusion. Miss Bingley wormed her way in between the couple and laced her arm with Mr. Darcy's. "Miss Eliza!" she cried. "Surely you do not mean to command all of Mr. Darcy's attention this evening?" "On the contrary, Miss Bingley, you are most welcome to join us as we continue our turn about the room, I'm sure." Elizabeth looked at Mr. Darcy. "Do you not agree, sir?" "Actually," Mr. Darcy began. "Excellent!" Miss Bingley interrupted. "By the way, Miss Eliza, I believe your sister requires your attention. Pray do not keep her waiting. I assure you Mr. Darcy is quite safe with me." Elizabeth half smiled. "Of course he is," she said half teasingly. "Mr. Darcy, it has been a pleasure." "Miss Elizabeth," he said, his voice filled with disappointment as he watched her steal away. Miss Bingley tugged at his arm, gaining his attention. "Come now, Mr. Darcy. If I did not know differently, I might suspect you were in just as much danger of suffering the same malady that overcame you when we were all in Hertfordshire." "Malady, Miss Bingley?" "Why, the anguish that a pair of fine eyes are wont to bestow." "I believe I spoke of the very great pleasure which a pair of fine eyes in the face of a pretty woman can bestow." He then gazed across the room, and looked longingly at Elizabeth sitting next to her sister, and wished with all his heart that she was still standing next to him. "And trust me when I say that I do indeed find that particular prospect more pleasurable now than ever before." Shaking Miss Bingley's arm loose from his, he walked away, having voiced the words that could cause the young lady no comfort at all. Before retiring that night, neither Jane nor Elizabeth could help but recount the events of the evening. At length Jane said, "I'm certainly the most fortunate creature that ever existed. Oh, Lizzie, if I could but see you as happy. How are things progressing between you and Mr. Darcy?" I know you did not always like him, but pray tell me your feelings have changed. I always suspected he harboured a tender regard for you. Indeed, he has been most attentive toward you since our being in town. Pray tell me that you're halfway, if not wholly and irrevocably in love. I can honestly say a part of me wants to give my heart to Mr. Darcy. Oh, then what is the matter? I do not know him as well as I think I ought to. Oh, Lizzie, do you not believe there will be plenty of time to get to know each other after you're married? I do not know, Jane. With thoughts of the intimacy she and Mr. Darcy had already shared always on her mind, Elizabeth blushed and looked away. I suppose I am not as trusting as you are when it comes to such matters. Sitting at the vanity, she picked up the silver-coloured brush and started sweeping it through her dark hair. Miss Darcy's words still lingered in her mind. Besides, you know how Mr. Darcy comported himself in Hertfordshire. Before I allow myself to fall completely in love with him, I need to know he is someone whom I can trust. Well, what do you think of Mr. Darcy? Elizabeth drew a deep breath. I think he is tall and handsome, and he is very, very rich. Pray be serious. Let me see. He is brooding, haughty, and aloof. Recalling the many times that she and Mr. Darcy walked side by side of late, trailing Jane and Bingley, Elizabeth continued. He never speaks just to be saying something. In most instances, he simply does not give himself the trouble. But a part of me suspects he is also rather shy. I know for a fact that when he has something to say, he does so without hesitation. Elizabeth stared at her reflection in the mirror. There is a part of him that is stern and severe, and another part that is tender and kind, she said, her voice trailing off in remembrance of their kiss. He is passionate, he is gentle. I say you seem to know him fairly well, Jane said, interrupting Elizabeth's sentimental soliloquy. I say further, trust yourself. Chapter 9. Standing all by herself outside the ballroom, Elizabeth took in the goings-on inside the opulent room. Once again, she and Jane found themselves guests at a London ball, accompanied by the Hursts. Mrs. Hurst, who had always been fonder of Jane than had been Miss Bingley, proudly introduced Jane to her friends and acquaintances as the future Mrs. Charles Bingley. Jane's reception among all those of Bingley's circle was just as Elizabeth had hoped it would be. She could not have been happier for her sister. As for her romantic entanglement, Elizabeth could not help being perplexed by this new side of Mr. Darcy. How was it possible that a gentleman could present such varying shades of character, depending on the company he kept? In Hertfordshire, people had thought him haughty and above his company. Most everyone he met was beneath him in consequence, and not worthy of his notice. While he was undoubtedly aloof, he was far livelier and much more agreeable among those whom he considered his equal. Elizabeth had taken to studying his character every chance she got. She had to know if he was indeed worthy of her absolute trust. On that night she witnessed more than she had bargained for as it concerned Mr. Darcy's character. With one hand against the wall to steady herself, and the other against her chest to calm herself, Elizabeth reeled at the scene that had just unfolded before her eyes. Mr. Darcy was strolling arm in arm across the dance floor with one of the most exquisite young ladies Elizabeth's eyes had ever beheld. Elizabeth was sure Mr. Darcy had not seen her staring. From the look of things, the other woman was the only thing, or rather the only one, capable of catching his eye. Who is she? Elizabeth wondered in one breath. What does it matter to me? She pondered in the next. Is seeing how he engages with those whom he considers his equals not the reason I've purposely avoided him this evening? She knew it was too much to suspect he was not just as lively and attentive to other young women as he had been to her since her arrival in town. It is just as well I learned the truth before allowing my heart to become irrevocably engaged. A light tap on her shoulder recalled Elizabeth's attention to her immediate surroundings. Upon turning to see who had intruded upon her private speculations, she rolled her eyes. There stood the last person she wished to see, even though it was a member of her arrival party that evening. "Miss Bingley!" Elizabeth cried. "Oh, for heaven's sake, Miss Eliza, when are you going to address me by my Christian name? For better or worse, we are practically family. Oh, do call me Caroline, and I shall call you Eliza." Elizabeth scoffed. She was in no mood for her sister's future sister-in-law at that moment. She wanted to return her attention to Mr. Darcy and his companion. Miss Bingley must have noticed Elizabeth's distracted manner. "What on earth is the matter? You look as though you've seen a ghost." She peered over Elizabeth's shoulder into the adjoining room and quickly surmised the object of Elizabeth's fascination. "Oh, there is our Mr. Darcy." This time it was Miss Bingley's turn to look peeved. She huffed. I ought to have known Lady Susanne would be clinging to his arm." "Lady Susanne?" Elizabeth heard herself repeating, albeit questioningly. "Yes, Lady Susanne Milton. I can see by your expression you're concerned for how I must be feeling to see Mr. Darcy with such a woman as that. But you need not worry on my behalf, I assure you." "I beg your pardon? Surely you must think the prospect of having competition for Mr. Darcy's affection would bother me? But it most certainly does not." Miss Bingley stretched her hand before her, and gazed upon it as though she were picturing a brilliant diamond wedding ring on her finger. "He may flirt with as many women as he chooses, and it would not matter one fig to me. That is how confident I am as regards his esteem for me. Oh, I've seen it all before. You will recall his unguarded attention to you many times when we were all in Hertfordshire," she scoffed. "I was sure nothing would come of it, and as always I was correct. I know that so long as I bide my time, Mr. Darcy will come to see that the woman he has long been searching for has been right here in front of him all along." Elizabeth could barely hide her confusion at hearing Miss Bingley speak that way. She always knew that the young woman suffered unrequited affection for Mr. Darcy, and cherished the hope of being the next mistress of Pemberley. She never supposed, however, the young lady was as delusional as this. "Why are you standing here looking stupid? Let us go over and greet Mr. Darcy." "No!" Elizabeth exclaimed with energy. "You go right ahead, Miss Caroline. I believe I've seen and heard enough for one evening." Elizabeth meant to escape the young woman's side, but was too slow. "Where are you off to, Eliza?" "I fear I feel a great headache coming on. I'm going to get a breath of fresh air." Later that evening, Elizabeth was wandering about the crowd searching for her sister, when she collided with a portly gentleman nursing a glass of wine. The dark burgundy beverage spilled all over Elizabeth's light-coloured gown. What a spectacle! "Pray watch where you're going, young lady," the gentleman said. "Look at what you've done," he bulked, staring at the stain on his white cuff. "Sir, I dare say we are both at fault." The proud man took umbrage to Elizabeth's account of the mishap. "I beg your pardon. I did nothing but stand here. You bumped into me. How am I at fault?" Elizabeth could feel unwanted eyes upon her. The last thing she needed was to draw attention to her current state. The spilled wine stain was quickly spreading. Elizabeth released an exasperated sigh and fled the room. A servant in the hallway directed Elizabeth to the nearest ladies' refreshment room. Inside, Elizabeth met another servant, who, recognizing Elizabeth's predicament, provided prompt aid. Elizabeth had no alternative but to stay put until the servant came back with her gown. She sat in an oversized chair, facing a massive ornate mirror that afforded a view of the passage. With many fashion magazines on the side table, she had more than enough to divert her while she waited. Elizabeth was not alone for long. Lady Susanne and another young woman of her ilk rushed into the room, practically bursting at the seams with girlish laughter. Seemingly unaware someone else occupied the room, they took turns making sport of the other female guests. The mentioning of Caroline Bingley's name drew Elizabeth's particular attention. "Now there is a spinster in the making," Lady Susanne said. "If I'm not mistaken, this is her third season on the marriage mart," said the other. "Are you quite certain? I heard this is her fourth." "Be it her third or her fourth, I say it's at least two too many, especially for someone with a dowry the size of hers. Perhaps if she did not suffer such lofty aspirations, she would have ensnared a husband by now." "I take it you're referring to her dogged pursuit of Mr. Darcy?" Elizabeth almost gasped aloud. Our Mr. Darcy? Who were these two to consider Mr. Darcy their rightful property? Hearing complete strangers speak uncharitably about Caroline Bingley meant nothing to Elizabeth, but now it seemed their conversation was personal. Lady Susanne scoffed. As if Fitzwilliam would marry someone whose family earned its fortune in trade. Fitzwilliam? Elizabeth silently screamed. Who is that young woman to Mr. Darcy that she should refer to him by his given name? Elizabeth wondered in one breath. Who is she to say what type of woman he will or will not marry? She questioned in the next. Lady Susanne and her companion continued to deride the means Caroline Bingley employed to capture Mr. Darcy, all to no avail. The details of their grousing mattered not to Elizabeth. Her mind was busily engaged in speculation concerning her particular predicament. Were fortune and connection truly as important to Mr. Darcy as the young lady suggested? Was this not what she suspected about him from the beginning of their acquaintance? Was what these two were saying different from what Mr. Darcy's sister espoused? The other young lady sneered. Are the shades of Pemberley to be thus polluted? Both ladies laughed out loud. Elizabeth knew not what to think or how to feel. She, more than anyone, knew Caroline Bingley stood no chance with Mr. Darcy, but she had seen the way he looked at Lady Susanne earlier that evening. The disturbing sentiments this picture invoked deep inside her she would not easily forget. She did not notice the servant's return. She was startled when the young woman cleared her throat. Your gown, madam. I did my best. I'm afraid the damage may be lasting, but it's not as bad as it was. Forcing a smile, Elizabeth glanced at the mirror, in time to see Lady Susanne and her companion looking her way. Is that not Caroline Bingley's friend over there? The latter asked. Lady Susanne raised a gloved finger to her lips. Indeed, she is. She shrugged. Yet another upstart who is ignorant of her place in our society? Whatever do you mean? Lady Susanne seized her companion's hand and pulled her towards the door. Come, I shall tell you all about her. The two of them scurried off, much to Elizabeth's relief and her chagrin. Do I honestly wish to spend my life amid such pretensions and callousness as this? What a disturbing prospect indeed! However, being mistaken for Caroline Bingley's friend unsettled Elizabeth even more. What an abominable prospect indeed! Chapter 10. For the rest of the evening, Elizabeth was content to stay as far away from the watchful eyes of others as she could manage. She exhaled a deep sigh of relief when it was time to return to her aunt and uncle's home with Jane, compliments of the Hursts. Elizabeth had not seen Mr. Darcy at all after espying him with Lady Susanne. She could only surmise he had left the party early. It was just as well the two did not meet face to face. There was too much for Elizabeth to ponder and too much to contemplate after what she had seen. She was not sure any meeting between them would not have evolved into confrontation and acrimony. Not that Elizabeth was able to dismiss her silent suppositions altogether. Soon enough she would seek answers to all her unasked questions. Soon enough Mr. Darcy would seek an answer too. Soon enough the two of them would stand face to face, deciding together what their futures held. Until we satisfactorily resolve the past, how might we possibly plan for a future? In 2 days Elizabeth and Jane would be returning to Hertfordshire. Bingley planned to arrive in Hertfordshire shortly after that to formally request Mr. Bennet's blessing on the impending union. Until such time, Jane meant to keep the happy news away from her family, else she was sure all of Meryton and its surroundings would know everything ahead of her return. With her time in town coming to a close, Mr. Darcy insisted that Elizabeth and her family dine at his home at least once. He wanted to introduce her to his uncle and aunt, Lord and Lady Edward Fitzwilliam, the Earl and Countess of Matlock. How he wished to introduce Elizabeth as his future wife. But alas, it was not to be. Not yet, anyway. He clung to the belief that it was only a matter of time. In the interim, he wanted his family to meet the woman with whom he was determined to share the rest of his life. More people were in attendance at Mr. Darcy's townhouse the next evening than even he had intended. In addition to Elizabeth, his unannounced guest of honour, and Jane and Bingley, he expected the Gardiners, the Hursts, Miss Bingley, and Lord and Lady Fitzwilliam. His sister Georgiana was also there to preside over his table for the evening, along with Mrs. Annesley. He also had invited his friend, Lord Reginald Milton. He most certainly did not invite Lord Milton's younger sister, Lady Susanne. Still, he had no reason to object to her coming along. However, there was another unexpected addition to his party he most certainly objected to. But what could he do? The uninvited guests were two of his closest relations, Lady Catherine de Bourgh and her daughter, Miss Anne de Bourgh, and her companion, Mrs. Jenkinson. What an interesting assortment of guests, indeed, from such varying walks of life. The formidable introductions between the parties from Cheapside and Matlock House went smoothly enough. The introduction between the parties from Cheapside and Kent were rather reserved. For Elizabeth's part, she did not know what to make of Darcy's relations as a whole. She suffered no doubt she would know exactly what they were about by the time the night was over. She did not fancy herself an excellent studier of people for nothing. When he could, Mr. Darcy drew Elizabeth aside for a private discussion before it was time to adjourn to the dining-room. "I meant this occasion to be my chance to introduce you to my uncle, his wife, and my cousin the Colonel. I had no idea my aunt, Lady Catherine, would venture all the way from Kent to be here. Allow me to apologise in advance for anything she may say or do." "Heavens, Mr. Darcy," Elizabeth said. "Surely her ladyship is not as bad as all that for you to apologise in advance. I recall my cousin Mr. Collins having nothing but the highest praise for her." "From what I recall of having met your cousin, Mr. Collins, I suspect he is the last person in the world whose opinion you ought to rely upon." Elizabeth had to admit Mr. Darcy's words held merit. Mr. Collins was indeed ridiculous. His sycophantic approbation of Lady Catherine de Bourgh and her daughter had served as fodder for ridicule behind his back. "Then let me thank you in advance, Mr. Darcy. To be forewarned is akin to being forearmed, I suppose." "My point exactly," he said. As though unable to resist himself, he leaned closer and whispered, "I knew you would understand my meaning. Is there any wonder I love you as I do?" Elizabeth could feel the colour spread all over her body. She had hardly reclaimed her composure when someone approached Mr. Darcy and her. "Colonel Fitzwilliam at your service," he said, bowing slightly before Elizabeth, effectively introducing himself. "My cousin," Mr. Darcy said in response to Elizabeth's silent inquiry. "I see you're late, as usual." "His favourite cousin as well as his oldest and closest friend," the Colonel said, ignoring Mr. Darcy's admonishment. The Colonel was about 30. Although not nearly so handsome as his younger cousin, he was most truly the gentleman in person and address. Elizabeth offered him her hand. "It is a pleasure to meet you, sir." Taking her hand, he said, "I assure you the pleasure is all mine." He gave her hand a gentle squeeze and released it. "Darcy has told me so much about you. I feel as though we're old acquaintances." "He has he?" Elizabeth asked, throwing a sly glance at Mr. Darcy. "Nothing that I ought to worry about, I pray?" "I should think not. Darcy has only the highest praise for you." Leaning closer and lowering his voice, the Colonel continued, "As one might expect, given the nature of your relationship." "Our relationship?" Mr. Darcy cleared his throat. "I believe your father, Lord Matlock, is in want of your company, cousin." The Colonel chuckled. "I believe this is Darcy's way of saying he wants you all to himself." He raised the glass he held in his hand. "Very well. I shall leave you two to your private affairs. Before I go, may I be the very first to wish the two of you joy?" When they were alone once more, Elizabeth said, "You told your cousin that we are getting married, sir?" Without awaiting a reply, she asked, "How could you, especially given that I have not yet agreed to anything?" Mr. Darcy shrugged unapologetically. "You heard the man. He's my oldest and closest friend. How could I not confide in him my heart's greatest desire?" He swept his eyes all over her. "Sooner or later, you will be mine. We both know it's only a matter of time." "Mr. Darcy!" Elizabeth exclaimed, perhaps with a bit more energy than she intended. Lowering her voice, she said, "You, sir, are incorrigible." Lady Catherine de Bourgh's behaviour at dinner had been abominable. She prodded the Bennet daughters with so many questions, the answers to which could have nothing to do with the great lady. She seemed most intent on targeting Elizabeth especially. Your eldest sister is to be congratulated for having made such an advantageous match, I suppose. But what of the rest of you? There are 5 of you in all, I believe. Are all of you out in society?" Elizabeth could hardly respond to one question before being bombarded with another. "Your father's estate is entailed on my vicar, Mr. Collins, I think. What a pity for your sake. I see no occasion for entailing estates from the female line. It was not thought necessary in St. Louis de Bourgh's family, which is a blessing indeed for my Anne. No doubt, any dowries you and your sisters may have are paltry at best. Do you play and sing, Miss Elizabeth?" The answers to her questions she scarcely acknowledged. Her inspection she did not relent. "No governess, you say?" Lady Catherine declared in response to a question on the matter. "How is that possible? 5 daughters brought up at a home without a governess? I never heard of such a thing. Your mother must have been quite a slave to your education." Elizabeth could feel the eyes of Caroline Bingley, Lady Susanne, and even Miss Darcy upon her, as she endeavoured to respond to Lady Catherine with more tact and deference than was afforded toward herself in the wake of such an inquisition. How I wish I had Jane's temperament in such a predicament as this. Finally, the Countess Lady Ellen sought to put an end to her sister-in-law's effrontery toward Elizabeth and Jane, but especially Elizabeth, with questions about the goings-on in Lady Catherine's parish. No doubt, Lady Ellen knew her meddlesome in-law very well, for this was a topic upon which the latter spoke of ad nauseam. Soon enough the dinner was over, and it was time for the ladies to leave the gentlemen to their port and cigars. Once in the drawing-room with the other ladies, Elizabeth could only endure so much of her uncomfortable predicament. Lady Catherine de Bourgh had scarcely taken her eyes off Elizabeth the entire evening. Heeding Mr. Darcy's advice, it was all Elizabeth could do to evade the haughty aristocrat. Elizabeth's eventual escape had landed her in Mr. Darcy's library. Truth be told, the thought crossed her mind of what it would be like to be mistress of a home with such a library. A plethora of books stretched before her eyes. To her understanding, this was nothing in comparison to the library at Pemberley. The prospect of one day being there and seeing it all for herself intrigued her. Elizabeth had not spent 10 minutes enjoying the idyllic sanctuary before an unwelcomed intruder entered the room. "Here you are," said Lady Catherine, ambling across the room to where Elizabeth sat. Elizabeth set the book she was perusing aside and stood. "What can I do for you, your ladyship?" The haughty aristocrat eyed Elizabeth intently. "It is not so much what you can do for me, but rather what I can do for you." "I beg your pardon, your ladyship?" "If you are as clever as I suspect you of being, Miss Elizabeth Bennet, you can have no doubt of the reason for my being here in town." "I assure you, your ladyship, I've not given your being in town any thought at all. We've only just met." "That may very well be. You, no doubt, have heard of me, and I most certainly have heard of you. I know it all." For a second, Elizabeth wondered how that might possibly be. Then it dawned on her. Of course, Mr. Collins, that toady man. Who is to say what he has told Lady Catherine de Bourgh about my family? Is that the reason for all her impertinent questions at dinner? Elizabeth said nothing. Lady Catherine said, "When my nephew Darcy wrote informing me of his intention to forego his annual visit to Kent at Easter, I took it upon myself to travel here to ascertain his reasoning." Kent at Easter? Elizabeth immediately thought of the invitation she had received from her intimate friend Charlotte Collins, née Lucas. Charlotte, who had accepted Mr. Collins' offer of marriage on the heels of Elizabeth's rejection of his proposal, and who, as a consequence of marrying the ridiculous man, now lived in the parsonage which abutted Rosings Park, Lady Catherine's estate. Since spending time with a horrid old woman towering over her would have been the consequence of being in Kent, Elizabeth congratulated herself on having declined Charlotte's offer. "My brother Lord Fitzwilliam wrote to me about rumours of Darcy's frequently being seen with a young lady with no connections, no money, and little to recommend her beyond a pretty smile. Imagine my surprise upon arriving in town and finding that very young woman traipsing about in my nephew's home." "What of your surprise, your ladyship? You speak as though I am the only young woman in attendance this evening." "Aside from your sister, you are the only one who lacks wealth and connection. What is more, you are the one who has garnered the greatest share of my nephew's approbation throughout the evening. There is nothing that escapes my notice, young woman. No doubt there is a reason he has singled you out above the likes of Lady Susanne and even Miss Bingley." Indeed, it appears you have used your feminine arts and allurements to draw him in ways those other two could not fathom. I can only imagine the true nature of your relationship with my nephew. Lady Catherine, I resent your insinuations about my character. My sister, my aunt, my uncle and I are guests in Mr. Darcy's home. Who are you to question our being here? Her ladyship clapped her hands. I applaud your feigned outrage, but you will have to try a lot harder if you mean to persuade me of your innocence. Whether or not you are convinced of my innocence is of no consequence to me. You may stand before me and level whatever spurious accusation toward me you choose. Your saying so does not make it so. Silence, young woman! I did not follow you here to argue such trivial matters as this. Men will be men after all. I expect no less of my nephew. No, I have another reason for desiring to speak with you in privacy. She drew close to Elizabeth, too close for Elizabeth's comfort. Elizabeth moved away from her chair. She then took a step back. Let me be rightly understood. Whatever you may or may not wish for yourself, should you have the presumption to aspire to marry my nephew, it can never take place. No, never. Mr. Darcy is engaged to my daughter. Now, what do you have to say? I say only this, Elizabeth replied. If Mr. Darcy is engaged, you can have no reason to suppose he will make an offer to me. Lady Catherine hesitated for a moment and then said, The engagement between them is of a peculiar kind. From their infancy they've been intended for each other. It was the favourite wish of his mother as well as of hers. While in their cradles we planned the union. She drew closer to Elizabeth once more. I do not mean for it to be prevented by a young woman of inferior birth, of no importance in the world, and wholly unallied to the family. Now standing so close to the haughty noblewoman, Elizabeth discerned an unmistakable family resemblance with the Darcy siblings in particular. What is the matter with these people? She wondered in silence, while supposing Miss Darcy had trained at her aunt's feet. Are they all like this? Elizabeth immediately rebuked herself for ascribing such unenviable character defects to the entire Fitzwilliam family for even a second. Lord and Lady Matlock and their son had been nothing but cordial to Elizabeth and her relations. As for Mr. Darcy himself, what would have been the point in denying her affection for him? Seeing him interact so agreeably with her family spoke volumes in his favour, and meant everything to her. Her courage rising in the face of such intimidation, Elizabeth asked, What is that to me? Should I desire to marry Mr. Darcy, I shall certainly not be kept from it by knowing that his mother and aunt wished him to marry Mr. Berg. You both did as much as you could in planning the marriage. Its completion depends on others. If Mr. Darcy is neither by honour nor inclination confined to his cousin, why is he not to make another choice? And if I am that choice, why may I not accept him? How dare you speak to me with such undignified impertinence? Have you no regard for who I am, or how I might make your life and the lives of your family miserable should I choose? You say a union between your nephew and your daughter is the favourite wish of your family. If that is true, I posit I am capable of disrupting the idyllic lives of you and your family too, am I not? And as I think about it, as the wife of Mr. Darcy, I would on the whole have no cause to repine. Neither would my family. Her ladyship gasped. Her hawkish eyes bulged. Why, you little— Lady Catherine reared her hand back to strike Elizabeth with her cane. It came within inches of Elizabeth's face, when Mr. Darcy seized his aunt's arm and forced the cane to fall to the floor. He had entered the room in the nick of time. Elizabeth stood frozen in astonishment and disbelief, shielded with gratitude for Mr. Darcy and cloaked with abhorrence for his aunt. "Lady Catherine!" he yelled. "Are you out of your mind?" Mr. Darcy kicked the cane across the floor. "Nephew, how dare you intercede against me on this woman's behalf? This impertinent upstart who ought to mean nothing to you." "You are mistaken. Miss Elizabeth means everything to me. And if you dare threaten her again, I shall see to it that it's the last thing you do." "Now stand aside," he said, taking a stunned Elizabeth by the hand and stepping in between the two women. "Miss Elizabeth and I have much to discuss, and I will not broker any interference from you or anyone else." "Things to discuss? What is the meaning of this?" "Leave us, Lady Catherine." Releasing Elizabeth's hand, Mr. Darcy took hold of his aunt's arm with force and led her toward the door. "Why, I have never been treated this way in my entire life. You will rue this day, nephew." Now marching on of her own accord, Lady Catherine said, "I shall take my leave of this house immediately, perhaps for ever. You deserve no further consideration from me, nephew. I am most seriously displeased." By now Mr. Darcy was standing at the library's door, awaiting his aunt's departure. "Your declaration suits me perfectly well, Lady Catherine. Tell my guests whatever you will, so long as they know Miss Elizabeth and I are not to be disturbed." Her ladyship gasped. Before she could fashion a reply suitable to her outrage, Mr. Darcy slammed the door shut and turned the key. Chapter 11. Mr. Darcy rushed to Elizabeth's side. He took her in his arms. He held her tightly. "I am sorry for my aunt's appalling behaviour. How can I make amends?" Elizabeth surrendered herself into his warm, protective embrace, but only for a moment or two before easing away. "I certainly do not blame you for the way your aunt behaved. Besides, it's not as though you didn't warn me. As a guest in your home, I suppose I ought to have conducted myself with greater dignity and constraint." She bit her lower lip. "As you may have discerned by now, my courage always rises with any attempt to intimidate me." Mr. Darcy laughed a little at this assertion. He had had too many heated discussions with Elizabeth to doubt the veracity of her sentiment. "My aunt is not used to having her will subjugated by the wants of others, but that's no excuse for the way she treated you. As you say, you are a guest, a most honoured guest. She ought not to have subjected you to a long-standing grievance she has with me. I suppose you're referring to your peculiar engagement with her daughter, Miss Anne de Bourgh." Crossing her arms, she continued, "Pray tell me, sir, which young woman in attendance is not vying for your affections?" Mr. Darcy placed a finger on Elizabeth's chin and lifted her head enough to meet his gaze. "Jealousy does not suit you, Miss Elizabeth, especially when I've given you no cause to doubt where my affections lie." Elizabeth consulted her watch. "Do you not suppose we ought to return to the party? Surely the party will miss us." "Not until we have this discussion." "But we have been away from the others for quite some time." "I know you only just met my cousin the Colonel, but let me assure you, so long as he has breath in his body to speak, he will not hesitate to do so. I have no doubt the rest of the party is quite diverted." Just as Darcy had presumed, the other members of the dinner party were diverted indeed, despite the Colonel's best attempts to persuade them into not speaking out loud what was heavy on everyone's mind. A single man and a single woman did not simply disappear from a dinner party with impunity. Where on earth is Mr. Darcy? Where in heavens is Miss Elizabeth? These were but two incarnations of the hushed whispers drifting throughout the drawing-room. Lady Catherine's abrupt appearance brought an end to the speculations. She threw a harsh stare about the room until her eyes settled on her daughter's companion. "Mrs. Jenkinson," she began, "accompany Anne to her apartment post-haste and oversee the packing of her things. We are leaving this place." All heads turned in the aggrieved woman's direction. "What are you saying, Catherine?" Lord Matlock asked, a stern nobleman who had scant tolerance for his sister's antics. He continued, "Travelling at such an hour as this is utter nonsense. What has come over you?" "I shall tell you what has come over me, brother. My nephew Darcy has lost his mind. He has completely forgotten what he is about. He has abdicated his responsibility to our family. As we speak, he is cloistered in the library with that little upstart, that little trollop, Miss Elizabeth Bennet." If Lady Catherine did not have everyone's attention before, she certainly had it now. All eyes and ears were wide open, attuned to her scurrilous assault. Such an affront could not go uncontested. Mr. Gardiner, an intelligent man who valued his family above all else, cleared his throat. His temper soaring, he said, "I beg your pardon, Lady Catherine. I will not have you speak disparagingly about Elizabeth, despite your rank and privilege compared to my own. This is my niece whom you are deriding. She deserves no such censure." Lady Catherine narrowed her eyes and glowered at the gentleman. "How else does one describe such an impertinent creature? Your niece disrespected me in the most outrageous manner. A proper young lady would never disrespect her elder, especially one whose rank is as superior as mine. She laughed in my face when I informed her that my nephew is engaged to marry my Anne." Here her ladyship paused and looked at her brother, hoping for his support. Who among us does not know it was the favourite wish of his mother that Darcy and Anne were to be married? Embarrassed, the Earl merely raised his hand to his face, burying his head in annoyance. He said nothing. Lady Catherine continued despite her brother's attitude. "And now she has the audacity to be locked inside the library with a single young man with whom she is wholly unconnected, no doubt enticing him with her arts and allurements. Heaven only knows what the two of them are doing." Feeling it absolutely necessary to defend his cousin, the Colonel interrupted his aunt's speech. "Lady Catherine, I have it on good authority that Darcy intends to propose to Miss Elizabeth. If they are together as we speak, he is no doubt offering her his hand in marriage." Not a single person in the room was immune to this declaration. Some smiled, some gasped, and then there were Lady Susanne's and Miss Bingley's reactions. The former nearly collapsed in horror and disbelief, causing her brother to race to her side. The other bolted from her seat and headed straight to the door. "Where on earth are you going, Caroline?" Mr. Bingley asked. "Why, I'm going to the library, of course. I mean to put an end to this madness." "I say we all go to the library," Lady Catherine exclaimed with energy. "This is madness, I say, unmitigated madness." Ignoring her ladyship's protest, Bingley put himself directly in his sister's path. "Return to your seat, Caroline." "Step out of my way, Charles. You and I both know Mr. Darcy belongs to me." "I know no such thing. Stop this foolishness. You're making a spectacle of yourself." The Colonel interrupted the bickering siblings. "I say no one is to go near the library. Anyone who has been paying attention knows Miss Elizabeth has captured Darcy's heart." This declaration cast a silent pall on the room. Even Lady Catherine fell quiet, albeit teeming with contemptuous indignation. "The only thing for any of us to do now is to give him the chance to capture all that might possibly remain uncaptured of hers, so she will accept his hand," the Colonel said, now standing in the doorway, effectively brokering no further objections. Meanwhile, despite her companion's reassurances, Elizabeth's concern about their absence and what others might think had not eased. "After my confrontation with Lady Catherine, I am hesitant to incur anyone else's wrath." She clasped her hands. She thought over the attitudes of some other members of the party who seemed put off by Mr. Darcy's inattention. Miss Anne de Bourgh, Caroline Bingley, and the most troubling of all, Lady Susanne. She even suspected a fair amount of intimacy between the latter and Miss Darcy. For Lady Susanne, when she was not throwing cross looks Elizabeth's way, scarcely paid attention to anyone save Mr. Darcy's sister, Mr. Darcy being the notable exception. "I dare say I was already the object of some of your guests' derision and scorn this evening. That is to say nothing of your sister." "My sister?" Mr. Darcy asked, his expression puzzled. "Are you not aware that she hates me?" "That does not sound like Georgiana." "Well, maybe hate is not the word, but I suspect that she objects to the idea of an alliance between you and me. I believe she might find someone of Lady Susanne's ilk more suitable, or perhaps Mr. Bourgh." "Why would you say something like that?" "She told me as much." "When?" "On the night of the Hursts' dinner party, the same night Mr. Bingley announced his engagement to my sister." "I fear I must apologise once again for one of my relations. I know not why Georgiana gave you such an impression, but I will find out. Not that her feelings on the subject can have any effect on my own. You ought to know by now that no one else speaks for me. Trust me when I say you are my heart's greatest desire." "Then why, pray tell, is Lady Susanne here?" Elizabeth immediately regretted her question. She did not mean to sound jealous. "You may as well ask me why Miss Bingley is here. Where the brother of either of the young ladies goes, so goes the sister, I suppose. Such matters are of no concern to me. Why, pray tell, should they matter to you? I shall not pretend to be blind to the way Lady Susanne looks at you, nor shall I go on pretending I did not see the two of you together at the Langleys' ball. Perhaps Elizabeth was indeed a little jealous. I looked for you that evening. I searched everywhere. You were nowhere to be found. Why did you not make your presence known? I would have introduced the two of you to each other. And intrude on such an intimate picturesque? Why, I did not dare. Why in heaven's not? Lady Susanne and I are connected through her brother, Lord Milton. She means no more to me than Bingley's sister means to me. He swept his fingers through his dark hair. Why are we even discussing those two? Because they are here, in your home, behaving as though they have a proprietary claim on you. Why do I suspect there's more to your feelings than you're telling me? I know Miss Bingley has earned your ill opinion, but what of Lady Susanne? It is not like you to form such an instant dislike to anyone. Has something happened between you and Lady Susanne? To be honest, I established my dislike of that young lady the night I first laid eyes on her. And no, Mr. Darcy, it has nothing to do with me being jealous upon seeing the two of you together. Rather, it's what I heard her saying about you later on that evening, disturbing things about your character. Sentiments echoed by your sister, in fact, and sentiments I long suspected to be true. What things, if I may ask? That you would never marry someone with no fortune or connections, and whose situation in life was far beneath your own. Yet I have vowed to make you my wife, have I not? Which begs the question, why me, sir? Especially when you might have any woman you choose. I have all the heart of mortal man can most desire. Splendid property, noble kindred, and extensive patronage. While it is not proper to boast of one's fortune, I would have to say mine is considerable, far vaster than you might imagine. I have everything I shall ever need, Miss Elizabeth. The only thing missing in my life is you. You say I might have any woman I choose. He took her hand in his. I cannot doubt that you might have any gentleman you choose either, Miss Elizabeth. Mr. Darcy gave Elizabeth's hand a gentle squeeze. I cannot stand before you and boast of my being the only man in the world capable of cherishing you, adoring you, and making all your favourite wishes come true. By now, he held both her hands in his. I will, however, tell you that you are the only woman in this world whom I wish to cherish and adore. If you would but say yes to my proposal of marriage, I will spend the rest of my days doing everything in my power to make your every wish come true. You know my feelings. I want you in my life. I love you. Please, Miss Elizabeth, give me the right to return with you to the party, the two of us hand in hand, and tell everyone that you are mine, that you have accepted my hand in marriage, and the two of us shall forever and for always live our lives as one, that whatever the odds against us, we will never, ever be parted. Feeling all the more reassured that Mr. Darcy's avowal was genuinely heartfelt, Elizabeth spoke the words Mr. Darcy longed to hear. Mr. Darcy took Elizabeth in his arms and kissed her lips, ever so tenderly at first, and ever so passionately as lingering moments slipped by. Though this was not Elizabeth's first time being kissed by Mr. Darcy, this was most assuredly their first kiss, as two lovers who had given their hearts to each other. Somewhere along the way, Elizabeth had fallen in love with Mr. Darcy, though she could hardly fix on the hour, or the spot, or the look, or the words that laid its foundation. I dare not think about it too much. Not at such an intoxicating moment as this, she silently considered, while surrendering herself in his arms, even as they endeavoured to keep their passions under good regulation. At length, wanting to catch their breath, the lovers drew apart. Their happiness was complete. All that remained was to share their joyful news with their family, their friends, and their acquaintances, who, no doubt, eagerly awaited their return to the party. Hand in hand, Mr. Darcy and Elizabeth shared a lingering gaze and smiled. As they turned to quit the room, she could not help but recall Jane's counsel as regarded Elizabeth's feelings for Mr. Darcy. Trust yourself. Standing beside her was undeniably the man whom she had been dreaming of for so long. Until the end of time, I have truly found someone to have and hold and love and cherish with all my heart and soul. Epilogue. 1 month later, a double wedding took place in Hertfordshire. What a joyous occasion for the proud mother whose business in life was marrying off her 5 daughters. While Mrs. Bennet could rightfully boast of knowing all along that her Jane was to be the mistress of Netherfield, even she was shocked by the news of her second eldest daughter's engagement to Mr. Darcy. Such a tall, handsome man of noble birth with £10,000 a year? She proclaimed him to be as good as a lord. Mrs. Bennet was not so nonsensical as not to appreciate all the benefits of such an advantageous alliance for the rest of her unwed daughters. While Jane's marriage was really something, it paled in comparison with Elizabeth's. The sensibilities of the 3 youngest Bennet daughters vastly improved once the 2 oldest had married. Mr. Darcy employed a live-in companion at Longbourn to do what Mrs. Bennet could not, and what Mr. Bennet apparently would not, especially where the youngest Bennet daughter Lydia was concerned. As the sister of Mr. Darcy, the wild-eyed girl was not to be without supervision. Hence she danced to her heart's content whenever she could, and constantly flirted to her heart's content, as everyone had reason to suspect she would. However, the opportunity to make her family ridiculous, as Elizabeth feared she might, and as Mr. Bennet proclaimed she was bound to do, never transpired, all thanks to Mr. Darcy's steadfast determination not to leave anything to chance where it concerned unsuspecting young females in the general vicinity of the likes of George Wickham. With 2 daughters married and the remaining 3 under proper supervision, with absolutely no trouble to himself, on the whole, Mr. Bennet could have no cause to repine. Speaking of Mr. Wickham, by the time Elizabeth and Jane had returned to Hertfordshire, he had gone off to Brighton with the militia. It was just as well that Elizabeth never saw him again. Wickham left a string of bad debts behind. Still, Elizabeth's need to know the reason for her husband's disdain of the gentleman would not be repressed. Mr. Darcy, not wishing to deny Elizabeth anything she deigned to request, confided in her all the sordid details of his past with a gentleman whom he considered his nemesis. The things he confided about Wickham's transgressions against young Miss Darcy appalled Elizabeth. Was there any wonder the young woman had come across as so misguided? To add to a litany of injustices toward Mr. Darcy, in pursuit of revenge and fueled by greed, Wickham had followed Miss Darcy to Ramsgate and had persuaded the young girl to elope. Had Wickham succeeded, his revenge against Mr. Darcy would have been complete. He did, of course, abscond immediately, leaving a broken-hearted and confused young girl in his wake. To Georgiana's credit, she apologised to Elizabeth for her attitude at the Hurst dinner party, citing her wounded pride. Armed with her own disappointed hopes, the details of which she too confided in Elizabeth regarding George Wickham and her belief that her brother hated Wickham for his standing in life, more so than the content of his character, she had spoken out of turn. In the end, she had taught herself to trust her brother's judgment, a consequence of a long overdue explanation for the real reason he had objected to his only sister marrying such a man as Mr. Wickham turned out to be. Miss Bingley's fate was not to be left untold. The young lady never stood a chance of garnering Mr. Darcy's affection. Neither did Lady Susanne Milton. Women who were always speaking and looking and thinking for his approbation alone were his abhorrence. Poor Miss Bingley. Appalled by Mr. Darcy's marriage, it was all she could do to mask her disappointment. "It should have been me," was her private refrain. In public, she adopted a more cordial stance towards the newlyweds. A standing invitation to Pemberley meant too much to her for her to behave otherwise. Lady Catherine, however, was not one to hide her true feelings from anyone. She did indeed take her leave of Darcy House on the night of her harsh encounter with her nephew, just as she had promised, but not before attempting to poison the rest of her family's minds against Elizabeth. All to no avail. Lord and Lady Matlock could not have been happier for their nephew. He had spent far too much of his life being alone not to enjoy a love match. Knowing Darcy's parents as well as they did, they were confident that the late Mr. and Mrs. Darcy would have had it no other way. A Christmas bonus. Mr. Darcy returned home from the neighbouring estate far later than he had planned. He could not help it, considering the sudden snowstorm. The first thing he did upon stepping foot inside the manor house was search for Elizabeth. The weather outside was frightful. Darcy hoped she had not ventured away from the house. When his efforts to find Elizabeth proved in vain, Mr. Darcy summoned his housekeeper. Surely she would know of his wife's whereabouts. To his dismay, his faithful servant, who was almost like a mother to him, informed him that Mrs. Darcy had spoken of visiting some tenants. Mr. Darcy wasted no time hurrying to the stables, hoping to find Elizabeth there, safely returned. The snow was falling hard as Darcy made his way to the stables, nearly covering his footsteps almost as soon as he planted them. Upon his arrival, a tense conversation with his head groomsman, Mr. Jackson, shattered Mr. Darcy's hopes. While Jackson could indeed attest to Mrs. Darcy's horse being in the stable, having seen it while passing by its stall a short while ago, he knew no more. "That is odd. I could not find Mrs. Darcy anywhere in the manor house." His heartbeat pounded against his chest. What of the carriage? What of the other horses? A big burly man, Jackson scratched his unkempt beard. "That I cannot say, Mr. Darcy. I believe my son will have taken care of that. I only just returned myself." He shook his head. "This storm is not meant for the faint-hearted." The man said nothing Mr. Darcy did not already know, having travelled in the storm himself, hence his dire concern. "I must speak with your son. Where is he?" "I suspect he's in the back of the stables. I shall fetch him at once." "I'll go with you," Mr. Darcy said, walking ahead of the other man in long, determined strides. They located the boy crouching by a blazing fire, warming his hands. "Your father tells me you might have returned the horse Mrs. Darcy used to visit some tenants?" "Did anything appear amiss?" "What of the carriage? Did you return it to its proper place as well?" The lanky young fellow removed his cap, and, holding it in both hands, shook his head. "I didn't see any carriage, Mr. Darcy. I only saw the horse standing about just outside the stable. I guess I figured it managed to escape its stall. So I led it back inside and checked the latch so the horse would not escape again." "No carriage? My God, how long ago was that?" "Few hours or more, I'd say." Mr. Darcy's complexion turned a startling shade of pale. "My wife!" He needed not say another word, for Mr. Jackson precisely knew the cause of his master's alarm. He had been the one to prepare Mrs. Darcy's carriage for her excursion earlier that day. "Shall I organise a search party, Mr. Darcy?" Jackson asked. Yes, of course. I cannot afford to sit around and wait. I must find my wife." He turned to Jackson's son. "Prepare my horse and do not forget extra blankets. No, secure the blankets and a decanter of whisky. I will prepare my horse. Hurry, time is of the essence." Treacherous road conditions impeded Darcy's progress every step of the way. The thought that his dearest Elizabeth might be out there wandering about, lost in a sudden and unexpected snowstorm, was too much to endure. But endure he must. Were the ground not blanketed with snow, Darcy would not have been nearly so worried. Having lived at Pemberley all his life, he knew every inch of Pemberley woods like the back of his hand. His wife, however, could not boast of such familiarity. What was worse, she had never experienced a Derbyshire winter. Any familiarity she had gleaned from her frequent rambles about the woods during the months since her arrival must surely mean nothing when covered with a blanket of snow that was growing deeper and deeper by the hour. He had seen no evidence of her on the road leading to Pemberley. Where had Elizabeth gone? Was she injured? It was getting darker by the minute. Soon there would be no light to shed evidence of his wife's whereabouts. Alas, there was a parting of trees that might easily have been mistaken as a viable path a little way back. Might Elizabeth have veered off on that path? Is that why I saw no trace of her on the main road? Darcy spurred on his horse to find out. He had travelled no more than a mile when he came across a most harrowing sight. Just ahead on the side of the lane, he espied an overturned carriage partially beneath a fallen tree. Before he knew what he was about, he was searching the wreckage for signs of his wife, while praying desperately that she had escaped unharmed. Elizabeth was not there. Neither was her lady's maid, who purportedly was his wife's travelling companion, and neither were any horses. But where were they? Were they wandering around blindly in the raging storm? Had they lost their way? Having stayed on the main road, Darcy had seen no sign of anyone. Returning to the manor house was not an option. Not if there was a chance Elizabeth was still out there somewhere, helpless, and worse yet, injured. Seizing his horse's rein, Darcy mounted it and plodded on. There was another clearing in the woods that his wife might have mistaken for the road to the manor house. He went that way. Amid fierce gusts of the wind howling through the trees, he called out her name. "Elizabeth! Elizabeth!" After a while, he spotted something, rather someone. A person collapsed on the snow-covered ground. "Elizabeth!" He jumped to the ground and hurried toward her. In an instant, a falling tree branch separated him and his horse. Grateful to escape harm, Darcy plodded onward to his wife. He fell to his knees and cradled her body to his chest. "Elizabeth!" he screamed, brushing the snow from her face. "Elizabeth, my love, can you hear me?" "Fitzwilliam?" she whispered, opening her eyes momentarily and then closing them again. "Yes, Elizabeth, I'm here. Wake up. You must not succumb to sleep." He held her close once more. He remembered there being an abandoned cabin nearby. His best hope was to get Elizabeth there as soon as possible. "Elizabeth," he pleaded, "stay with me, my love. My life with Elizabeth is all I dreamed it would be. Indeed, Darcy's idea of paradise. She came into his life and made his house a home. I cannot lose this heaven. Stay with me." With the snow falling at an even faster pace, and Elizabeth cradled in his arms, Darcy could not say how long he had walked, but at length he had found the place. The old wooden cabin was still there, worse for wear after decades of neglect, but still there. Soon enough he was kicking in the door. Once inside, a glance about the one-room dwelling confirmed there was firewood aplenty, dry and nicely stacked against the opposite wall. There was a fireplace, a rotting table, and a couple of wooden chairs. Missing was a bed. The cold, dust-ridden wooden floor would be the only place to stretch out and rest their heads. There was no blanket in sight. Darcy recalled telling the groomsman's son to gather one. He made a mental note to venture outside and retrieve it from his horse, assuming the horse was anywhere around. For now, saving Elizabeth was his only thought. Making a fire and removing her wet clothing was his primary employment. Sitting her down, he immediately removed her snow-covered coat and surrendered his greatcoat to shield her from the cold. Elizabeth grew more lucid by the second. "It is cold," she said, trembling. "I know, my love. I need to remove your wet clothing, and then I shall build a fire." In that respect, Darcy was very well prepared. "I am tired. Sleepy," Elizabeth said, her voice trailing off. "So sleepy." I know, but I need you to stay with me for now. Once I attend your attire and build a fire, you'll feel better. I need you to stay with me." In time, Darcy had removed Elizabeth's damp clothing and even clothed her with his shirt. He had also started a fire. The two of them cuddled in front of the fireplace with his greatcoat shielding them. "I am sorry." Darcy gazed at the top of his wife's head resting on his chest. He held her closer. "What of my maid? What of Hannah? Did she return safely to the house?" "That I cannot say. Let us pray she has." "I am sorry," Elizabeth said once again. "You have no reason to be sorry, my love. You could not have known there would be a sudden storm, one of this magnitude no less." He brushed a tender kiss atop her head. They were safe. Most importantly, Elizabeth was safe. Nothing else mattered to him. Elizabeth could not help but blame herself for venturing out on a cold winter's day, and inadvertently finding herself in a sudden and violent snowstorm. The housekeeper had hinted that Elizabeth ought not to do so. Obstinate, headstrong girl. Sooner or later I was bound to find myself in a tough predicament. With the impending plan to travel to Matlock the next day for Christmas, Elizabeth wanted to attend to last-minute errands before leaving Pemberley. She surely regretted having subjected her lady's maid to such peril. She prayed the young lady had returned safely to the manor house, having sent her ahead for help after a falling tree toppled their carriage. Elizabeth was to follow once she freed the second horse. She did indeed free the frightened mare, but had no choice but to watch in dejected hopes and despair as it bolted away. Alas, after setting off by foot, she lost her way. Shivering, Elizabeth clung tighter to her loving husband, grateful that he had found her before it was too late. "Are you feeling better, my love?" Mr. Darcy asked. Elizabeth nodded and nuzzled her nose against his neck. "This will be our first Christmas as husband and wife. I must say we are off to quite an inauspicious start. The circumstances are not quite as I'd hoped they would be. What with the two of us stranded here in an abandoned cabin during a snowstorm," he said. "The material point is that we are husband and wife." Darcy raised a quizzical eyebrow. "Elizabeth, my love, what are you about?" "It's so cold. It's almost as cold inside as it is outside. Can you think of a better way to fend off the chill until the fire serves its purpose?" She took his hand in hers. "As two people violently in love with each other as we are, what say you that we do what lovers do at such a time as this?" Such a suggestion as that awakened every fibre in Mr. Darcy's being. Had he not uttered words of a similar vein to Elizabeth on Twelfth Night? There could be but one answer to his wife's question. Earlier on, once Elizabeth was settled by the fire, Darcy had ventured outside searching for his horse. Just as he had dreaded, the horse was not there. The horse's return to Pemberley must certainly increase the rescue party's urgency, he supposed, refusing to suffer defeat. Thankfully, he had thought to tuck the decanter of whisky inside his greatcoat, so there was that. With no blankets to shield and protect them, they relied upon Mr. Darcy's greatcoat atop of them, and Elizabeth's coat underneath them. She was solely adorned in his shirt, while her clothes dried a safe distance from the fireplace. With no inconvenient barriers between them, at length their bodies grew warmer and warmer from the flames of their shared passions. Once spent, the young lovers settled in for what seemed like a long winter's nap. They were warm and dry, and they were together. Nothing else mattered. Throughout the night, Darcy arose to attend the fire and to assure Elizabeth that soon enough they would be back at Pemberley warming themselves by a blazing fire in the comfort of their bed. It must have been around midnight when Mr. Darcy awakened to the calm tranquillity that had settled outside. Still cradling his wife in his arms, he brushed a kiss atop her head. "The worst of the storm is behind us. Thank heaven for that." The next morning, the sound of someone pounding on a blocked door excited the lovers, the answer to their prayers. Mr. Darcy had propped a chair underneath the rusted-out, broken doorknob to impede anyone's entry without his knowing. Having awakened and dressed long before the break of dawn, Darcy and Elizabeth were eager to be away from the cabin, even if it had been the source of such wondrous bliss throughout the long night. With Elizabeth close by his side, Darcy was on the verge of opening the cabin door when he paused, leaned low, and placed his hand on his wife's stomach. "It is time that we get your mother safely back to Pemberley where she belongs. What say you, young master?" Elizabeth laughed a little. "You're very sure of your own opinion, Mr. Darcy. What if this little wonder we've created is a girl?" His hand lingering in place, Mr. Darcy said, "If she brings half as much joy to my life as you have, my dearest, loveliest Elizabeth, I shall have no cause to repine." Touched by such an endearing sentiment, Elizabeth placed her hand on her lover's chin. "I concur wholeheartedly with that emotion." Standing on her tiptoes, she brushed a light kiss on his cheek. "Merry Christmas, Mr. Darcy." This has been Christmas, Love and Mr. Darcy, written by P.O. Dixon, narrated by Andy Robert.